Morning arrives as it always has, carrying a thin light that moves slowly across the upper floors before settling against the glass. Windows open in small increments. A curtain shifts, then stills. Somewhere below, a door closes with the same careful pressure it has known for years, neither hurried nor delayed. The sound travels briefly, touching the walls before dissolving into the quiet that follows it. There is no visible break in the rhythm of the place. No marker that separates this morning from the one that came before. Before the day carries you further into these quiet routines, you might choose to remain connected to them, by subscribing, if you feel this kind of stillness is something you'd return to again. A bicycle leans where it was left. Its frame holds a fine layer of dust that has gathered over several days, undisturbed except for the faint imprint of a hand near the seat. The tires have softened slightly, but not enough to collapse. It remains upright, balanced against the wall as if waiting for a decision that has not yet been made. Across the street, a shop window reflects the sky in muted tones. The display inside is sparse, arranged with care that suggests continuity rather than abundance. Labels remain in place, though the items behind them have shifted, replaced, or quietly removed. There are footsteps, but they do not rush. They move along the pavement with a measured consistency, each step placed without hesitation yet without urgency. A man pauses at the corner, not because he needs to, but because the act of pausing has become part of the movement itself. He looks down the street, then across it, his gaze resting briefly on nothing in particular. The gesture is habitual, but it carries a new weight, one that does not announce itself but lingers in the way his shoulders settle before he continues. You begin to notice the spaces between actions. The slight delay before a hand reaches for a handle. The way conversations, when they occur, remain close to the ground, as if sound itself has learned to stay low. Voices do not carry as far as they once did. They fold inward, contained within the immediate space, careful not to travel beyond what is necessary. Even laughter, when it appears, is brief and self-contained, ending just before it might expand into something larger. A vehicle passes, its movement steady, its presence neither disruptive nor entirely familiar. It does not belong to the street in the way the others do, yet it moves through it without resistance. Its sound lingers longer than expected, echoing faintly against the buildings before fading into the distance. No one turns to follow it. The absence of reaction becomes its own form of acknowledgement, a quiet agreement not to engage with what cannot be altered. The air carries a stillness that is not quite silence. It holds the residue of activity, the suggestion of things continuing just out of view. Curtains lift and fall. A window closes with a soft, deliberate motion. Somewhere above, water runs briefly through pipes, then stops. These are the sounds of a place maintaining itself, holding its structure together through repetition. Nothing in them suggests interruption. And yet, something has settled into the pattern, something that does not leave when the sound fades. Inside the buildings, rooms retain their familiar shapes. Tables remain where they have always been. Chairs hold the imprint of use, their surfaces worn in the same places. A coat hangs near a doorway, its weight unchanged, its presence unremarkable. The objects do not resist the shift that has taken place around them. They continue to exist within it, absorbing its quiet pressure without altering their form. It is in their stillness that the change becomes more difficult to locate, more difficult to name. Time moves, but it does not push forward. It gathers instead, layering itself over what is already there. Minutes pass without distinction, folding into one another until the act of measuring them begins to lose its edge. The morning does not build toward anything. It unfolds, evenly, without interruption. The expectation of change, if it exists at all, remains distant, held at the edge of thought where it does not interfere with what must be done. You find that nothing demands your attention directly. There is no single point that calls to be understood. Instead, the awareness spreads outward, settling over the entire scene at once. The street, the buildings, the people moving through them, all of it holds together in a way that feels complete, even as something within it has shifted beyond immediate recognition. The absence of disruption becomes its own form of presence, steady and unyielding. A door opens again, this time more slowly. A figure steps out, pausing just long enough to adjust to the light before moving forward. The motion is careful, not from hesitation, but from a kind of quiet precision that has taken hold in small, unnoticed ways. The body learns to move differently when the environment changes, even if the change is not spoken. Each step carries that learning forward, embedding it deeper into the routine until it no longer feels new. Nothing here resists. Nothing here declares itself. The street continues, the morning holds, and the rhythm remains intact. And within that continuity, something has already begun to settle, not as an event, but as a condition that will not leave when the day moves on. The light continues its slow movement, slipping further down the walls until it reaches the level of the street, where it settles briefly before being broken by passing shadows. A figure crosses through it, then another, each movement leaving only a faint impression that disappears as quickly as it forms. Nothing lingers long enough to become a moment. Everything passes through, carried forward by a rhythm that does not ask to be understood. A woman stands near a doorway, her hand resting against the frame as if testing its solidity. She does not look outward immediately. Instead, she listens, her attention turned toward the layered quiet that fills the space beyond the threshold. There is no single sound that draws her forward. It is the absence of disruption that allows her to step out, to join the movement already in progress without needing to consider it. Her posture remains composed, her pace measured, as though each action has already been practiced many times before. Further along the street, a delivery is being made. The exchange is brief, efficient, almost without acknowledgement. A package changes hands, its weight transferred without comment. The man who receives it nods once, not in gratitude, but in recognition of a process that no longer requires explanation. The door closes behind him with the same controlled motion as before, sealing the interaction into something complete and self-contained. No trace remains except the continuation of the day. Windows reflect more than they reveal. Behind the glass, shapes move in ways that suggest activity without offering detail. A figure passes, then pauses, then disappears again into the interior. The distance between inside and outside feels wider than it appears, as though the glass holds more than separation. It carries a quiet boundary, one that is not enforced by force but by understanding. What happens within remains there. What moves outside does not look in for long. You begin to notice how little is said. Words, when they appear, are chosen with care, shaped to fit within the space allowed to them. Conversations do not stretch. They begin and end without expansion, leaving no loose edges behind. A question is answered, but not extended. A statement is acknowledged, but not explored. The language has adjusted, narrowing itself to what is necessary, avoiding anything that might reach beyond the immediate moment. There is a bench at the edge of the street where two people sit without speaking. They do not look at each other, nor do they seem to expect to. Their presence together is not defined by interaction, but by proximity. Each remains within their own line of thought, their stillness aligned but not shared. Time moves around them, touching their shoulders briefly before continuing on. They do not follow it. They remain where they are, held in place by something that does not require explanation. A distant sound carries through the air, low and sustained, then fades before it can be identified. No one reacts. The absence of reaction becomes part of the pattern, reinforcing the quiet agreement that has settled over the space. It is not that the sound is unnoticed. It is that noticing it does not lead anywhere. The body registers it, then releases it, returning to the rhythm that has already been established. Inside a nearby room, a clock marks the passage of time with a steady, unchanging cadence. Each tick is identical to the last, precise and indifferent. It does not accelerate or slow. It does not respond to what occurs around it. Its function remains intact, even as the meaning of time begins to shift in quieter ways. Minutes are counted, but they do not carry the same weight. They accumulate without urgency, forming a continuous surface rather than a sequence of distinct points. You find that attention begins to settle differently. It no longer seeks what is new or unexpected. Instead, it rests on what repeats, on the small consistencies that hold the day together. The opening of a door, the passing of footsteps, the brief exchange of objects. These become the anchors, the points around which awareness gathers. They do not demand interpretation. They simply exist, steady and reliable, within a world that has adjusted itself without announcement. Nothing here asks to be questioned directly. The structure holds, the routine continues, and the surface remains intact. And beneath it, something quieter has taken root, not visible, not declared, but present in the way each movement is carried out, in the way each moment resolves without extending beyond itself. It is not imposed in a single instant. It settles gradually, aligning itself with what is already there until it becomes difficult to separate one from the other. For now, the street remains as it is, composed, continuous, undisturbed in appearance. And as it continues, you stay with it a moment longer, allowing the rhythm to hold without interruption. The street that continues. The street holds its shape as the day advances, its edges defined not by what has changed, but by what has remained in place. The buildings rise with the same quiet authority, their facades carrying the accumulated marks of years that do not distinguish between one period and another. Light moves across them without interruption, tracing the same paths it has always followed, indifferent to the presence that now exists within the space. Nothing in the structure announces a beginning or an end. The continuity itself becomes the surface upon which everything else rests. A shop door opens with a familiar resistance, the hinge offering a soft, controlled sound before giving way. Inside, the air is slightly cooler, held in place by walls that absorb and release temperature slowly. Shelves line the interior, arranged with a precision that suggests maintenance rather than abundance. Items are spaced carefully, their placement adjusted to fill gaps that were not there before. The shopkeeper moves between them without hesitation, her hands following patterns learned long ago, though the objects they touch are not always the same. She does not pause to consider this. The motion continues, carried forward by repetition rather than intention. Outside, a man approaches the window and stops just short of the glass. His reflection meets him before the contents do, overlaying his features onto the arrangement behind it. He studies the display, but not for long. The act of looking has become shorter, more contained, as though extended attention might draw something unnecessary into view. He nods once, a gesture that does not signal agreement or satisfaction, but completion. The decision, whatever it is, remains internal. He turns and continues down the street, his pace unchanged. You begin to notice how movement organizes itself without direction. People do not gather, yet they do not avoid one another entirely. They pass at measured distances, adjusting slightly without acknowledgement, their paths aligning just enough to prevent interruption. There is no visible coordination, yet the pattern holds. Each person moves within a narrow band of predictability, leaving space where space is expected, closing it where closure is required. The result is a flow that feels uninterrupted, even as it carries a quiet awareness of itself. A window above the street opens a few inches, then stops. A hand rests on the frame, fingers curled lightly against the wood. The person behind it does not lean out. Instead, they remain just inside, positioned at the edge between interior and exterior. The street is visible from there, but only in fragments, a passing shoulder, the top of a hat, the shifting light. The view is partial, controlled. It offers enough to confirm that the day continues, but not enough to invite participation. Further along, a child walks beside an adult, their steps slightly out of sync. The child's pace quickens, then slows, adjusting to the rhythm imposed by the hand that holds theirs. The adult does not look down. Their attention remains forward, fixed on the path ahead as though it requires continuous monitoring. The grip is steady, neither tight nor loose, but consistent. It communicates direction without needing to change. The child glances briefly to the side, drawn by something unseen, then returns to the forward motion, the moment of divergence closing as quietly as it opened. There is a cart positioned near the corner, its wheels angled slightly as if it had been turned and left mid-adjustment. The goods it carries are covered, the fabric drawn over them with care. No one attends to it directly, yet it is not abandoned. It exists within the shared understanding that objects, like people, remain where they are placed unless moved with purpose. Its presence marks a point in the street, a fixed element around which movement reorganizes itself. People step around it without breaking stride, their paths bending just enough to accommodate its position. The sound of footsteps continues, layered now with the faint rhythm of something metallic in the distance. It repeats at regular intervals, not loud enough to dominate, but persistent enough to be noticed. The source remains out of view, yet its consistency gives it form. It becomes part of the environment, an addition that does not disrupt but integrates, altering the texture of the sound without changing its volume. No one looks toward it. The act of listening does not extend into inquiry. Inside the shop, the woman adjusts a label, aligning it with the edge of the shelf so that it sits precisely beneath the item it names. The label itself is older than the object, its edges worn slightly from handling. She presses it down with a measured motion, ensuring it holds. The act is small, almost invisible, yet it carries the weight of maintaining order within a space that depends on such details to remain coherent. When she steps back, she does not evaluate the result. She moves on, her attention already shifting to the next task. You find that the street does not ask for interpretation. It presents itself fully formed, each element in place, each movement contained within its own boundary. There is no single point that draws the eye, no center that demands focus. Instead, attention moves across the surface, settling briefly before continuing on. The effect is not one of emptiness, but of completeness, a system that functions without requiring acknowledgement. A door closes again, this time with slightly more force than before. The sound travels further, reaching the opposite side of the street before fading. For a moment, it lingers at the edge of perception, as though it might become something more. But it does not. It settles back into the pattern, absorbed by the continuity that defines the space. Nothing follows it. Nothing needs to. The street continues. It does not pause, does not signal transition, does not indicate that anything within it has shifted beyond recognition. And within that continuity, The conditions that shape it begin to take hold, not as interruptions, but as extensions of what is already there. The street carries forward into the late morning without altering its pace. The light, now steadier, settles across the lower walls and lingers along the pavement, where it is broken into fragments by passing feet. Shadows shorten, then gather again beneath benches, beneath carts, beneath the narrow spaces where objects meet the ground. Nothing moves quickly enough to disturb the balance. Even change, when it occurs, does so without urgency, folding itself into the existing pattern rather than replacing it. At the corner, a small group forms without intention. Two men stand near the edge of the pavement, their bodies angled slightly away from each other, as though the space between them must remain intact. A third joins briefly, offering a few words that do not extend beyond the immediate exchange. Their voices remain low, shaped by a habit that no longer requires conscious effort. When the third man leaves, the space he occupied closes slowly, not through movement, but through the quiet reassertion of distance. The group dissolves without acknowledgement, returning the corner to its previous state. A woman exits a building carrying a folded piece of paper. She holds it close to her body, not concealed, but contained within a gesture that limits its visibility. Her steps are even, her gaze directed forward, though her attention appears divided between the path ahead and the object in her hand. She does not open it. The act of carrying is enough. The meaning, whatever it holds, remains suspended, deferred until a moment that has not yet arrived. You begin to see how objects travel through the space without drawing notice. A parcel passes from one set of hands to another, its surface unmarked by anything that would distinguish it from the others. It is not examined, not weighed visibly, not questioned. The exchange is brief, completed within a single motion that begins and ends without interruption. Once transferred, it becomes part of the new holder's movement, absorbed into the flow as though it had always been there. Further along, a doorway remains open longer than expected. Inside, a narrow corridor extends into shadow, its depth obscured by the absence of light. A figure stands just within, neither fully visible nor entirely hidden. They do not step out. Instead, they watch the street in segments, their view interrupted by the frame that holds them in place. The threshold becomes a point of suspension, where presence is divided between interior and exterior without resolving into either. The sound of the distant metallic rhythm continues, now joined by the softer tones of daily activity, the shifting of objects, the brief contact of materials, the muted closing of doors. These sounds do not compete. They layer over one another, forming a surface that feels continuous, even as each element maintains its own identity. The ear adjusts, no longer separating one from the other, allowing them to merge into a single, steady field. Inside the shop, the woman moves to the back room, where the light is dimmer and the air carries a different weight. Boxes are stacked along the walls, their contents known but not displayed. She opens one, removes an item, and holds it briefly before placing it on a nearby surface. The motion is deliberate, measured, as though each step must be completed in sequence without deviation. She does not rush. There is no visible pressure to do so. And yet, the care with which she moves suggests an awareness that extends beyond the immediate task. A child's voice rises briefly from somewhere out of sight, then lowers again, guided by a quiet correction that does not need to be heard to be understood. The sound does not carry far. It folds back into the space from which it came, contained within the boundaries that have formed around it. The street receives it, acknowledges it in passing, then releases it without response. You begin to sense that the continuity of the street depends on these small adjustments, these subtle recalibrations that occur without drawing attention. Each movement, each sound, Each interaction is shaped by a set of conditions that do not declare themselves openly. They are learned through repetition, reinforced through absence, and maintained through a shared understanding that does not require articulation. A man stops near the cart at the corner, his hand resting briefly on its edge. He does not move it. The contact is momentary, almost incidental, yet it establishes a connection that lingers after his hand withdraws. He looks down at the covered goods, then away, as though the act of looking must remain incomplete. When he continues on, his pace does not change. The interruption is absorbed, leaving no visible trace. The woman with the folded paper reaches another doorway and pauses. This time, she opens the paper slightly, just enough to confirm what it contains, then closes it again with the same careful motion. The gesture is brief, controlled, and entirely self-contained. No one nearby reacts. The act exists within its own boundary, neither hidden nor displayed, part of a sequence that remains private even as it occurs in public. The street does not shift in response. It continues to hold its form, its rhythm, its quiet coherence. And within that steadiness, something begins to take root, not as a disruption, but as a pattern that repeats often enough to become expected. The presence that moves through the space is no longer unfamiliar. It has been absorbed into the structure, into the timing of actions, into the spacing between people. You notice that attention no longer searches for difference. It settles instead on consistency, on the ways in which the day unfolds without deviation. The absence of interruption becomes the condition that defines the experience. What might once have been remarkable now passes without comment, integrated into the flow that carries everything forward. The street continues. Not unchanged, but unbroken. And within that unbroken surface, the first layer of adjustment settles fully into place, no longer separate from the routine that sustains it. The shop and its measures. The shop holds a different kind of time. Inside, the light arrives filtered, slowed by glass that softens its edges before it reaches the shelves. It does not move freely across the room. It settles in narrow bands, touching only what lies directly in its path, leaving the rest in a muted, steady dimness. The air feels contained, shaped by the walls that hold it in place, carrying the faint scent of paper, fabric, and something older that does not leave even when the door opens. Nothing here moves without leaving a trace, even if that trace cannot be seen. The woman returns from the back room with an object held carefully in both hands. It is not heavy, yet she supports it as though it requires balance. She places it on the counter and aligns it with the edge, adjusting its position until it sits parallel to the grain of the wood. The motion is small, almost invisible, but it completes something that would otherwise remain unsettled. When she steps back, her eyes pass over it briefly, not to evaluate, but to confirm that it has entered the system correctly. A man enters, his movement marked by a slight hesitation at the threshold. He pauses just long enough for the door to close behind him before stepping fully inside. His gaze moves across the room, not searching, but registering what is present. He does not approach the counter immediately. Instead, he walks along the shelves, his hands remaining at his sides, his attention passing over each item without stopping. The act of looking has become a form of measurement, a way of understanding what is available without engaging with it directly. You notice how distance is maintained even in close quarters. The space between the man and the woman remains intact, defined not by physical barriers, but by an understanding that does not require reinforcement. When he reaches the counter, he places his hand upon it lightly, not to claim the space, but to anchor himself within it. The gesture is brief. He withdraws it before it can settle into anything more permanent. The woman waits. She does not ask what he needs. The question is implied within the structure of the place, carried by the arrangement of objects, by the position of the counter, by the simple fact of his presence. When he speaks, his voice remains low, shaped by the same restraint that governs movement. The words are few, chosen carefully, as though each must pass through a narrow opening before being released. She listens without interruption, her expression unchanged, her attention fixed on the space between them rather than on his face. Behind her, the shelves hold items that are both familiar and altered. Their placement suggests continuity, but their quantity does not. Gaps appear where there were none before, filled with objects that do not fully match what they replace. Labels remain, though the things they refer to have shifted, their meaning stretched to accommodate what is now available. The system holds, but it does so through adjustment rather than stability. The man produces a small card from his pocket. It is worn at the edges, its surface marked by repeated handling. He places it on the counter with a motion that is both deliberate and restrained, as though the act must be completed without drawing attention to itself. The woman takes it, her fingers touching it only briefly before setting it beside the object he has indicated. She does not examine it closely. The recognition is immediate, practiced, requiring no visible confirmation. You begin to understand how transactions occur without exchange in the usual sense. Nothing is negotiated. Nothing is questioned openly. The process unfolds along a fixed path, each step following the one before it with quiet precision. The woman reaches beneath the counter and retrieves something wrapped in paper. She places it beside the object, aligning them carefully before sliding both toward the man. He does not touch them immediately. Instead, he looks at the arrangement, his gaze moving between the items and the card that now rests slightly apart. There is a pause, not of uncertainty, but of completion. The process has reached its end, yet it does not release him all at once. He remains for a moment longer, as though confirming that nothing has been left unresolved. Then, with a measured motion, he gathers the items and the card, returning the latter to his pocket without examining it further. The woman's hands return to the counter, resting lightly against its surface. She does not follow his movement as he turns to leave. Her attention shifts instead to the space he has vacated, as though it requires a moment to settle before it can be used again. When the door opens and closes behind him, the sound is absorbed quickly, leaving the room as it was before his arrival. Outside, the street continues, its rhythm unchanged. Inside, the system resets. The woman reaches for the next object, adjusting its position slightly, restoring the alignment that defines the space. The shelves remain as they are, their gaps neither hidden nor emphasized. They exist within the structure, acknowledged but not addressed directly. The process continues, not because it must, but because it has become the way in which the space sustains itself. You notice that nothing here resists. The movements are controlled, the interactions contained, the outcomes predetermined within a narrow range of possibilities. The shop does not impose this order. It reflects it, holds it, allows it to persist without interruption. Each action reinforces the next, building a continuity that does not depend on variation to remain intact. A second figure approaches the door, their silhouette visible through the glass before they enter. The woman does not look up immediately. She completes the adjustment she has begun, ensuring that the object sits precisely where it should. Only then does she lift her gaze, ready to receive the next presence within the same quiet structure. The process repeats. Not identically, but without deviation. And within that repetition, something begins to settle more firmly into place, a pattern that no longer requires attention to be maintained. The door closes again with the same restrained motion, its sound brief and contained, as though it has learned not to travel further than necessary. The second figure steps inside without hesitation, their movement already shaped to fit the space. There is no pause at the threshold this time. The adjustment has been made elsewhere, before arrival, carried inward as part of the body's quiet preparation. The woman acknowledges the presence with a slight inclination of her head, a gesture that completes the introduction without requiring words. The figure approaches the counter more directly than the one before, though the pace remains measured, consistent with the rhythm that holds the room together. A small object is placed upon the surface, not presented, not offered, simply set down in a position that aligns with what is expected. You begin to notice how expectation replaces instruction. No signs indicate how to proceed. No visible rules govern the exchange. And yet, each step unfolds with a precision that suggests long familiarity. The woman reaches for the object, turning it once in her hand before setting it aside. Her attention shifts briefly to a ledger that rests partially concealed beneath the counter. She opens it without fully exposing its contents, her hand moving across the page in a motion that suggests both reading and remembering. The figure waits. There is no sign of impatience, no shifting of weight that might indicate urgency. The stillness is not passive. It holds a quiet engagement, a readiness that does not press forward. The body remains aligned with the process, allowing it to complete itself without interference. Time, in this moment, does not stretch or compress. It holds steady, defined only by the sequence of actions that continue to unfold. Behind them, the shelves carry their arrangement forward. The gaps that appeared earlier remain, though their presence has softened. They no longer draw the eye as they once might have. Instead, they exist as part of the structure, integrated into the pattern rather than standing apart from it. Objects shift subtly to accommodate them, expanding their presence without altering their form. The system adjusts, not by replacing what is missing, but by redefining what is sufficient. The woman closes the ledger and returns it to its place. From beneath the counter, she retrieves another item, wrapped more tightly than the one before. The paper holds its shape, its edges folded with care that suggests intention rather than necessity. She places it on the counter, aligning it with the object that was brought in, creating a correspondence that requires no explanation. The figure nods once. The gesture is slight, contained within the movement of the head rather than the body. It signals completion, not agreement. The process has reached its end, and the acknowledgement confirms that nothing further is required. The exchange concludes without extension, without the need for additional words or actions. The object is taken, the space is cleared, and the figure turns to leave. You begin to understand how completion is marked not by conclusion, but by absence. When the figure exits, nothing follows. The room does not respond. The shelves do not shift. The woman does not watch the departure. The moment resolves by returning to what was already in place, leaving no residue that might suggest interruption. A faint sound emerges from the street, the same metallic rhythm, now slightly closer, its repetition steady enough to become part of the interior experience. It filters through the glass, softened by distance, yet persistent in its cadence. The woman pauses briefly, her hand resting on the counter as the sound passes through the space. She does not look toward it. The pause is not a reaction, but a recognition that does not require acknowledgement. You notice how the body learns to register without responding. The senses remain active, receiving information continuously, yet the movement that might follow is held back, contained within a boundary that has become difficult to perceive from the outside. The woman resumes her task without alteration, her hands moving with the same measured precision as before. The rhythm of the room absorbs the interruption, returning to its steady flow without resistance. A third presence appears at the doorway, visible only as a shifting outline against the light. This time, there is a longer pause before entry, a moment in which the figure remains outside, partially obscured by reflection. The delay does not disrupt the interior. It exists at the edge of the space, suspended between arrival and continuation. Inside, the woman adjusts the position of a small stack of items, aligning their edges so that they form a clean line across the surface. The action is repeated twice, each adjustment refining the placement until it satisfies a condition that cannot be seen directly. When she finishes, her hands remain still for a moment, resting lightly against the objects as though confirming their stability. The figure at the doorway steps in. The sequence begins again, not as a repetition of what has already occurred, but as a continuation that carries forward the same structure, the same quiet precision, the same absence of deviation. Each exchange reinforces the pattern, deepening its presence within the space until it no longer appears as something that has been learned. It simply is. You find that the shop no longer feels like a place of transaction. It has become a place of process. The difference is subtle, yet it shifts the meaning of everything within it. Objects are not simply obtained. They are moved through a system that defines their passage, shaping the way they are received, the way they are held, the way they leave. The people within it do not direct this system. They inhabit it, moving through its structure with a familiarity that removes the need for conscious navigation. Outside, the street continues to carry its steady rhythm. Inside, the measures hold. And within that held structure, the second layer of adjustment settles more deeply, no longer distinct from the actions that sustain it. Lines that form without instruction. The line is not announced. It begins as a pause. One person stands where movement might have continued, their position held for a moment longer than necessary. Another arrives and slows, not fully stopping at first, then settling into place just behind, leaving a measured distance that feels neither accidental nor precise. A third approaches, adjusting their path slightly to align with what has already formed, their steps shortening as they near the point where forward motion gives way to waiting. No signal marks the transition. The line takes shape quietly, assembling itself from small decisions that do not require coordination. The space in which it forms remains unchanged. The pavement holds its familiar texture, the edges of the buildings define the same boundaries, and the light falls as it did earlier in the day. Nothing in the environment instructs the body to stop. And yet, the stopping occurs, carried by an understanding that does not need to be expressed. The line exists because it is recognized, not because it is enforced. At the front, a door opens and closes with a steady rhythm. Each time it opens, one person disappears inside. Each time it closes, the line advances by a single step, the movement passing through it like a quiet signal that requires no acknowledgement. No one counts. No one marks the progression. The distance between individuals remains consistent, maintained through subtle adjustments that occur without visible effort. You begin to notice how waiting takes on a shape of its own. It is not empty. It is filled with small actions that hold the body in place, a shift of weight from one foot to the other, a brief adjustment of a sleeve, a hand resting momentarily against the side of the body before returning to stillness. These movements do not break the line. They exist within it, contained by the same quiet structure that defines the space. A man near the middle of the line looks ahead, his gaze resting not on the door, but on the space just before it. The person in front of him stands with their back slightly curved, their shoulders drawn inward as though reducing their presence. The man does not step closer. He maintains the distance, allowing the space between them to remain intact. The line does not compress. It expands and contracts only within narrow limits, preserving its form without drawing attention to itself. Further back, a woman holds a small bag close to her body. Her fingers tighten briefly around the fabric, then loosen again, the motion repeating at irregular intervals. She does not look at the bag. Her attention remains forward, aligned with the direction of the line, even as her body registers the presence of the object she carries. The gesture does not resolve into anything more. It continues, contained within the act of waiting. The door opens again. A figure steps out this time, their movement quick but controlled, their eyes directed downward as they pass along the edge of the line. No one turns to follow them. The departure does not alter the sequence. The person at the front steps forward, crossing the threshold with the same measured motion as those before them. The door closes, and the line advances once more, the shift passing through it without sound. You begin to sense that the line does not belong to any single moment. It persists beyond the individuals who enter and leave it, reforming as needed, maintaining its structure through repetition rather than permanence. The people within it do not hold it together. They move through it, entering and exiting without altering its existence. The line remains, carried forward by the conditions that sustain it. A child stands beside an adult near the back, their presence slightly offset from the alignment of the others. The child shifts from one foot to the other, their movement more visible, less contained. The adult's hand rests lightly on their shoulder, guiding them into stillness without pressure. The adjustment is gentle, almost imperceptible, yet it brings the child's movement into alignment with the rest of the line. The difference narrows, then disappears. The sound of the street continues around them, muted by the focus that settles over the space. Footsteps pass nearby, voices drift at a distance, the metallic rhythm persists somewhere beyond view. These elements do not interrupt the line. They move alongside it, parallel to its structure, existing without crossing into it. The boundary is not marked, yet it holds. You notice how time behaves differently here. It does not move forward in the usual sense. It gathers at the front, where each opening of the door releases a small portion of it, allowing it to pass through before closing again. Those who wait do not measure it directly. They feel its presence in the repetition, in the sequence that continues without variation. Each step forward carries them closer to something that is not fully visible, yet clearly defined within the structure of the line. A man near the front reaches into his pocket and removes a small object, turning it once in his hand before returning it to its place. The motion is brief, contained, and without consequence. It does not alter his position. It does not draw attention. It exists within the waiting, filling a moment that would otherwise remain unmarked. The door opens again. The line advances. No one speaks. No one needs to. The pattern holds. And within that pattern, something begins to settle more firmly, a rhythm that no longer requires attention to be maintained, a structure that carries itself forward through the quiet alignment of those who enter it. The line continues. The line settles deeper into itself as the day moves forward, its shape no longer tentative, no longer forming, but fully present. What began as a pause now holds as a condition. The bodies within it adjust less. Movements that once marked the effort of waiting begin to recede, replaced by a stillness that feels practiced rather than imposed. The distance between each person remains, not maintained actively, but preserved through habit that no longer requires attention. The door continues its rhythm. It opens. It closes. It releases one, then receives another. The sound remains consistent, its repetition smoothing the edges of time until each interval feels less distinct from the one before it. You begin to sense that the door no longer marks progress. It marks continuity. The movement through it does not accelerate or slow the experience. It simply confirms that the sequence continues. A figure near the middle shifts forward without the door opening. The movement is slight, almost imperceptible, yet it passes through the line in a soft wave, prompting those behind to follow. The adjustment corrects itself quickly, restoring the spacing that defines the structure. No one reacts. No one acknowledges the change. The line absorbs it, returning to its previous state without leaving a trace of the interruption. You begin to notice how correction happens without instruction. There are no visible signals, no gestures that guide the body back into place. The adjustment emerges from within the pattern itself, carried by a shared understanding that has taken root through repetition. Each person senses the alignment, the spacing, the rhythm, and when it shifts, even slightly, the response follows without thought. The system sustains itself through these small, continuous recalibrations. At the front, the threshold holds a quiet tension. The space just before the door feels denser, not because of any visible change, but because of what it represents within the sequence. The person who stands there does not lean forward. They do not prepare visibly to enter. Instead, they remain still, their posture unchanged, their gaze directed toward a point that lies just beyond the frame of the doorway. The moment before entry is not marked by anticipation. It is marked by containment. The door opens. The figure steps forward, crossing the threshold with the same measured motion as those before. There is no hesitation, no glance back. The movement is complete as it occurs, leaving nothing behind to suggest that it required decision. The door closes, and the space at the front fills again, the next person stepping into position without altering the rhythm. Further back, the woman with the small bag no longer tightens her grip. Her hand rests against the fabric without movement, the earlier tension having settled into a steady hold. The repetition of the sequence has smoothed the variation in her gestures, aligning them with the stillness that surrounds her. The object she carries remains present, but its weight no longer expresses itself through motion. It has been absorbed into the posture she maintains. A man near the back shifts his gaze from the door to the ground, then back again, his attention moving within a narrow range that does not extend beyond the immediate space. The act of looking no longer seeks information. It follows a pattern, returning to the same points without expectation of change. The environment does not offer variation, and the body no longer searches for it. You begin to understand how waiting becomes its own form of activity. It is not the absence of movement, but a different kind of movement, one that occurs within the boundaries of stillness. The body remains engaged, holding position, maintaining alignment, adjusting in ways that do not disrupt the surface. The mind follows, narrowing its focus to what is necessary, releasing what lies beyond the immediate sequence. The sounds of the street continue to pass along the edges of the line. Footsteps approach and recede. A distant voice rises, then lowers. The metallic rhythm persists, its cadence unchanged. These elements no longer register as separate from the experience. They merge with it, forming a background that supports the condition without altering it. The line exists within the street, but it also exists apart from it, defined by a structure that does not depend on its surroundings. A child near the middle has stopped shifting. Their body now mirrors the stillness of the adults, their movements contained within the same narrow limits. The earlier difference has been absorbed, not through instruction, but through proximity. The alignment has extended to include them, bringing their presence into the same quiet pattern that holds the others. The door opens again. The line advances. No one counts the steps. No one marks the passage. The sequence continues, steady and unbroken. You find that the expectation of change begins to recede. There is no anticipation of a moment that will alter the experience. The line does not lead toward revelation. It leads toward continuation, toward the same process repeated until it no longer feels like a process at all. The body accepts this, settling into the rhythm without resistance. The line continues, not because it must, but because it has become the way in which time moves through this place. And within that movement, the structure of compliance begins to take hold more fully, not as a requirement, but as a condition that no longer needs to be questioned. The paper that moves between hands. The paper does not draw attention to itself. It appears in the space as other objects do, carried in a hand, folded once or twice, its edges aligned with care that suggests habit rather than instruction. It does not stand out from the other things that move through the day, parcels, bags, small wrapped items, and yet it carries a different kind of weight. Not visible, not expressed through the way it is held, but present in the way it passes from one person to another without interruption. A man stands just outside a doorway, the paper resting between his fingers. He does not look at it. His gaze remains forward, directed toward the street, as though the act of holding is separate from the act of seeing. When another figure approaches, he extends his hand slightly, the motion contained within a narrow space that does not invite attention. The paper changes hands without pause. The exchange is completed before it can be observed as an event. The second figure continues walking. The paper is now part of their movement, absorbed into the rhythm of their steps. It does not alter their pace. It does not change the direction they follow. It simply exists within the sequence, carried forward as though it had always been there. When they reach the corner, they slow briefly, adjusting their path to avoid the cart that remains in place, then continue on without deviation. You begin to notice how the paper moves through the environment in segments. It does not travel directly from one point to another. It passes through multiple hands, each transfer brief, each movement contained within the same quiet structure that governs the rest of the space. No one holds it for long. No one examines it openly. Its presence is acknowledged only through the act of carrying, through the way it is folded, through the way it is placed and received. A woman stands near the edge of the street, her hand resting against the wall as she waits. When the figure approaches, she turns slightly, creating a space that allows the exchange to occur without interruption. The paper is placed into her hand with a motion that mirrors the one before it, precise, contained, without extension. She does not unfold it. Instead, she tucks it into the sleeve of her coat, where it rests out of view but not concealed. The movement continues. You begin to understand that the paper does not belong to any single person. It belongs to the system through which it moves, defined not by its content, but by its passage. The individuals who carry it do not direct its path. They participate in it, contributing to a sequence that extends beyond their own actions. Inside the shop, the woman receives a similar piece of paper. It arrives folded, its surface marked by the same subtle wear that comes from repeated handling. She places it on the counter beside the ledger, aligning it carefully before opening the book. Her fingers move across the page in a pattern that suggests both recognition and confirmation, though the details remain out of view. The paper is not read in the usual sense. It is processed, integrated into a structure that does not require visible interpretation. A man stands nearby, his posture unchanged as he waits. He does not look at the paper. His attention remains fixed on the space just beyond the counter, where the exchange will complete itself. The presence of the paper does not alter his behavior. It exists within the process, one element among others, carrying a function that is understood without being stated. The woman closes the ledger and returns the paper to its folded state. She does not hand it back. Instead, she places it beneath the counter, where it joins others that have already passed through the same sequence. The action is quiet, almost invisible, yet it marks a point within the system, a moment where the movement of the paper changes direction, where its passage becomes part of something that no longer circulates through the open space. You begin to notice how accumulation occurs without visibility. The papers that pass through the day do not disappear. They gather, stored within spaces that are not immediately accessible, forming a record that exists alongside the visible structure. This accumulation does not announce itself. It remains hidden, integrated into the environment in a way that does not disrupt the surface. Outside, the woman with the paper in her sleeve continues walking. Her movement remains steady, her posture unchanged. The paper rests against her arm, its presence indicated only by the slight adjustment in the fabric. She does not touch it. She does not confirm that it remains there. The act of carrying has already been completed. The rest unfolds without intervention. You find that the meaning of the paper is not located in what it contains. It resides in how it moves, in the way it passes without interruption, in the way it is received without question, in the way it becomes part of a sequence that does not require explanation to continue. A figure approaches from the opposite direction, their path intersecting briefly with the woman's. For a moment, their movements align, then diverge, each continuing along their respective routes. No exchange occurs. The paper remains where it is, held within the pattern that has already been established. The street continues to carry its steady rhythm. Within it, the paper moves quietly, its passage unmarked, its presence absorbed into the flow. And as it moves, the structure that governs its path becomes more firmly established, extending itself through repetition until it no longer appears as something separate from the day. The paper continues its passage without altering the surface of the day. It moves through the street in small intervals, each transfer contained within gestures that do not extend beyond what is necessary. A hand reaches, another receives, and the exchange resolves before it can gather weight. Nothing marks the moment as distinct. No one pauses long enough to separate it from the movements that surround it. The continuity holds, carrying the paper forward as part of the same quiet system that governs everything else. A man walks along the edge of the pavement, his coat drawn close despite the mildness of the air. The paper rests within his inner pocket, its presence indicated only by the slight adjustment in the way the fabric falls. He does not touch it. His hands remain at his sides, his steps measured, aligned with the rhythm that has settled into the street. When he reaches a narrow passage between two buildings, he turns without hesitation, his path shifting just enough to bring him out of the main flow. Inside the passage, the light changes. It narrows, filtered by the walls that rise on either side, creating a space that feels separate without being hidden. The sounds of the street soften here, reduced to a distant layer that does not fully enter. The man slows, his pace adjusting to the enclosure, and for a moment, he stands still. The paper remains where it is. The pause does not signal uncertainty. It marks a point within the sequence where movement briefly suspends itself before continuing. Another figure enters from the opposite end. Their approach is steady, their posture unchanged. When they meet, there is no exchange of words. The man reaches into his coat and produces the paper, holding it briefly before extending it forward. The second figure receives it with the same contained motion, their fingers closing around it without delay. The transfer completes itself within a single, uninterrupted action. Neither looks at the other. Their attention remains fixed on the space between them, where the exchange has already concluded. They part without acknowledgement. The man returns to the street, his path merging again with the steady movement that defines it. The second figure continues through the passage, the paper now integrated into their movement. It does not alter their direction. It becomes part of it, carried forward without drawing attention to itself. You begin to notice how the path of the paper adjusts without being directed. It does not follow a straight line. It bends, pauses, resumes, its movement shaped by the spaces through which it passes. Each segment appears self-contained, yet together they form a sequence that extends beyond any single exchange. The individuals who carry it do not appear to know the full path. They participate in it, completing their part without needing to see where it leads. Back in the shop, the woman retrieves one of the papers from beneath the counter. She unfolds it slightly, not enough to read, but enough to confirm its form. Her fingers move across the surface in a motion that suggests familiarity, then fold it again with the same care as before. The paper is placed into a different stack this time, separated from the others by a narrow space that marks a distinction without explaining it. The system continues to organize itself through these small adjustments, each action reinforcing a structure that remains largely unseen. A man enters the shop and places his own paper on the counter. It is folded more tightly than the others, its edges pressed together as though to reduce its presence. The woman takes it, aligning it with the ledger before opening the book. Her hand moves across the page, tracing a path that corresponds to the paper's position. She does not look up. The man waits, his posture unchanged, his attention fixed on the process rather than the object itself. You begin to sense that the paper is no longer separate from the system. It does not carry information in a way that invites interpretation. It carries function. Its movement, its placement, its alignment within the ledger, these define its role. The content remains secondary, held within a structure that determines how it is used without requiring it to be examined openly. The woman closes the ledger and places the paper beneath the counter, this time in the same stack as the others she has just sorted. The distinction between them dissolves as they are brought together, their individual paths converging into a single accumulation that continues to grow without being seen. Outside, the second figure emerges from the passage and returns to the street. Their movement remains steady, their posture unchanged. The paper is now gone, its presence replaced by the continuation of the sequence. They do not look back. The act of carrying has been completed, and with it, their role within this segment of the system. You notice how completion leaves no trace. There is no indication that the exchange has occurred, no mark left on the environment, no shift in the rhythm of the day. The paper has moved, the sequence has advanced, and yet the surface remains intact, unchanged in appearance, continuous in its flow. The street continues. The shop holds. The passage remains. And within these spaces, the movement of the paper becomes more deeply integrated, no longer distinct from the actions that carry it forward. You find that the system no longer requires attention to sustain itself. It persists through repetition, through alignment, through the quiet understanding that governs each movement. The paper is only one element within it, yet its passage reveals the structure more clearly than anything else. Not because it stands apart, but because it moves within the same conditions that now shape everything. Rooms that hold the quiet. The rooms do not change their arrangement. Tables remain where they have always been, their surfaces worn in familiar places where hands have rested, where objects have been set down and lifted again. Chairs stand in their usual positions, angled slightly toward one another as if conversation might still occur in the same way it once did. Light enters through the windows in narrow, consistent bands, touching the edges of the floor before retreating slowly as the day progresses. Nothing within the room announces a shift. The structure holds, intact and unaltered in its visible form. A woman sits at the table, her hands placed flat against the wood. She does not move them immediately. The contact remains steady, her fingers relaxed but not idle, as though the surface beneath them provides a point of reference that does not need to be questioned. In front of her lies a small object, a cup, empty now, its position unchanged since it was last used. She does not reach for it. The act of sitting, of remaining within the space, appears complete in itself. From another room, a faint sound carries through, the soft closing of a drawer, followed by the brief pause that always follows such a motion. The sound does not invite response. It settles into the space, acknowledged but not pursued. The woman's posture does not shift. Her attention remains where it is, held within the boundaries of the room. You begin to notice how stillness becomes structured. It is not the absence of activity, but a different kind of activity, one that unfolds within a limited range. The body remains engaged, maintaining position, adjusting in ways that do not extend beyond the immediate space. A slight shift of the shoulders. A breath taken more slowly than before. The movement is contained, shaped by the same conditions that govern the exterior world, though expressed here in quieter forms. A man enters, closing the door behind him with a controlled motion that prevents the sound from carrying. He pauses just inside, allowing the space to settle around him before stepping forward. His gaze moves across the room, not searching, but registering what is present: the table, the chairs, the woman seated with her hands resting against the surface. He does not speak. The presence of another does not require immediate acknowledgement. He takes a seat opposite her. The chair makes a soft sound as it moves, then stills. The distance between them remains unchanged, defined not by the size of the table, but by an understanding that has settled into their movements. They sit without looking directly at one another, their attention aligned with the space rather than with each other. The room holds them both, containing their presence within its steady structure. On the wall, a clock marks the passage of time with a quiet, even rhythm. Each tick is identical, its sound consistent, unvarying. It does not draw attention, yet it remains present, a subtle measure that continues regardless of what occurs within the room. The woman's breathing aligns with it, not consciously, but through the gradual adjustment that comes with repetition. The man's posture settles in the same way, his shoulders lowering slightly as the rhythm takes hold. You begin to sense how time behaves differently here. It does not press forward. It accumulates, layering itself over the stillness until the distinction between one moment and the next begins to soften. The absence of external movement allows the internal to emerge more clearly, though it does not announce itself. It remains beneath the surface, present in the way the body holds itself, in the way attention narrows to what is immediately at hand. A sound from outside passes briefly through the walls, the distant metallic rhythm, softened by distance but still recognizable. It does not interrupt the room. It enters, touches the space lightly, then fades. Neither the woman nor the man reacts. The sound exists alongside the stillness, integrated into it without altering its structure. On the table, the cup remains untouched. Its presence does not demand action. It sits as it was placed, a small element within the larger arrangement, holding its position without drawing focus. The woman's hands remain where they are, her fingers resting against the wood as though the contact itself sustains something that does not require movement to continue. The man shifts slightly, adjusting his position in the chair. The motion is minimal, contained within the space he occupies. It does not disrupt the stillness. It becomes part of it, absorbed into the pattern that holds the room together. When he settles again, the alignment returns, the balance restored without effort. You begin to understand how the room contains more than objects. It holds the absence of what is not said, the weight of what does not move, the presence of others without the need for interaction. These elements do not appear separately. They merge into a single condition, one that defines the experience without needing to be named. A door in the adjacent room opens slightly, then closes. The sound is soft, controlled, as though shaped by the same restraint that governs everything else. The movement beyond remains unseen, yet it is felt within the space, acknowledged without being followed. The room absorbs it, maintaining its structure without interruption. The woman's hands lift briefly from the table, then return. The motion is small, almost imperceptible, yet it marks a point within the stillness, a moment where the body adjusts, then settles again. The contact resumes, the surface once more providing the quiet anchor that holds her in place. The man looks toward the window, his gaze resting on the light as it shifts across the floor. He does not follow its movement. He allows it to exist within the space, part of the same continuity that defines everything else. When he returns his gaze to the room, nothing has changed. The room remains. Not empty, not full, but held. And within that held space, the quiet begins to deepen, shaping itself into something that no longer requires movement to be felt. The room continues without shifting its form. The light withdraws from the center of the floor and gathers along the edges, thinning as it climbs the lower part of the wall. The change is gradual, almost unnoticeable unless followed closely, and yet it alters the balance of the space in small, precise ways. Shadows lengthen beneath the table, beneath the chairs, creating deeper pockets where the eye no longer rests. The room does not grow darker all at once. It narrows, holding less light in each passing moment. The woman remains seated, though her posture has softened. Her hands no longer press against the surface with the same firmness. They rest there now, lighter, as though the need to hold contact has diminished. The cup in front of her has not moved. Its position has become fixed, no longer part of an action that might resume, but part of the arrangement that defines the table itself. She does not look at it. It exists within the space without drawing her attention. The man's breathing has slowed. It aligns less with the clock now, drifting slightly from its steady cadence, though the difference is subtle. His gaze remains directed toward the window, where the light continues to shift. The outside world is present only in fragments, a passing shadow, a brief reflection, the suggestion of movement beyond the glass. He does not follow these fragments. He allows them to remain incomplete, part of a larger continuity that does not enter the room directly. You begin to notice how the room separates from what lies beyond it. The sounds of the street, once more distinct, now reach the interior as softened impressions. Footsteps no longer register as individual movements. Voices lose their edges, blending into a low, continuous tone. The metallic rhythm persists, but it arrives altered, its sharpness reduced, its repetition absorbed into the background. The room holds its own condition, allowing the outside to exist without fully entering. A chair in the corner remains unused. Its position has not changed, yet its presence feels more pronounced now, as though the absence of movement around it has given it weight. The space it occupies is defined not by use, but by the possibility of use that does not occur. It stands as part of the arrangement, contributing to the balance without participating in it. The man shifts his hands, placing them flat against his thighs. The motion is slow, deliberate, contained within the space he occupies. It does not signal intention. It completes itself without leading to anything further. When his hands settle, they remain there, the gesture absorbed into the stillness that holds the room together. You begin to sense how presence changes when it is not expressed. The woman and the man remain within the same space, yet their awareness does not reach outward. It folds inward, contained within the boundaries of the room, shaped by the absence of exchange. The proximity does not create interaction. It creates a shared condition, one that does not require acknowledgement to exist. A faint draft moves through the room as the air shifts near the window. It touches the surface of the table, passes along the edge of the cup, then dissipates before reaching the opposite wall. The movement is slight, barely enough to be felt, yet it marks a change within the stillness, a subtle reminder that the space continues to breathe even when nothing within it moves. The clock continues its steady rhythm. Each tick remains identical, yet it no longer defines the experience of time. It exists alongside it, separate, consistent, unaltered. The room does not follow it. It holds its own measure, one that expands and contracts without visible markers, shaped by the duration of stillness rather than by the passage of seconds. The woman lifts her hands again, this time resting them in her lap. The table remains untouched. The contact that once anchored her has been released, not through decision, but through a gradual shift that has already taken place. Her posture adjusts slightly, her shoulders lowering as she settles into a different alignment, one that no longer depends on the surface in front of her. The man does not respond. He remains as he is, his gaze still directed toward the window, his hands resting where they were placed. The absence of response does not create distance. It maintains the condition that holds them both, allowing each to exist within the same space without crossing into the other's presence. You begin to understand how the room sustains itself through absence. Nothing is required to happen. Nothing is expected to change. The structure holds, not through action, but through the continuation of what is already in place. A sound from the adjacent room carries through once more, a faint movement, then stillness. It does not draw attention. It confirms that the space extends beyond what is visible, that other rooms hold similar conditions, similar arrangements, similar quiet continuations. The house exists as a series of these spaces, each contained, each aligned with the same underlying rhythm. The light fades further. The edges of the room soften, the boundaries less defined. The objects remain, their shapes intact, yet their presence becomes quieter, less distinct. The woman and the man remain within this dimming space, their positions unchanged, their movements minimal, their awareness contained. The room holds. Not as a place of rest, not as a place of action, but as a place where the absence of both becomes the condition itself. And within that condition, the quiet deepens, no longer separate from those who inhabit it. It settles into them. Conversations that do not fully form. The conversation begins before it is heard. It gathers in the space between two people standing close enough to speak, yet not close enough to close the distance entirely. Their bodies angle slightly away from one another, as though preserving a margin that must remain intact. The street moves around them without interruption, carrying its steady rhythm past their stillness, leaving them momentarily outside of it. A man adjusts his sleeve. The gesture is small, contained, performed without urgency. It completes itself before his hand returns to his side, leaving no trace beyond the motion itself. The woman across from him shifts her weight, her posture settling into a position that suggests readiness without expectation. Neither looks directly at the other. Their attention rests somewhere between them, held within a space that does not invite expansion. The first words arrive quietly. They do not extend beyond what is necessary. A question, shaped carefully, released without emphasis. It does not seek detail. It does not open into further inquiry. It exists within a narrow frame, one that limits what can follow. The woman answers in the same manner, her voice low, her tone even, her words completing the exchange without extending it. You begin to notice how language narrows. It no longer carries the same range. It moves within boundaries that are not defined aloud, yet clearly understood. Sentences shorten. Descriptions fade. What might once have been explained is now implied, or left unsaid entirely. The conversation does not build. It settles, completing itself quickly before it can become something larger. A pause follows. It does not feel incomplete. It holds its own structure, filling the space without requiring resolution. The man looks briefly toward the street, his gaze aligning with a movement that continues around them. The woman does the same, her attention shifting outward, as though the conversation has already reached its natural end. Another sentence forms, then dissolves before it is spoken. The man's lips part slightly, then close again. The thought remains unexpressed, held within a boundary that has become difficult to cross. The absence of speech does not create tension. It maintains the condition that defines the interaction, preserving the balance that has already been established. You begin to understand how silence becomes part of language. It does not interrupt. It completes. What is not said carries as much weight as what is spoken, shaping the exchange without needing to appear. The conversation exists within this balance, moving forward in small increments, then stopping, then resuming, each segment contained within its own limits. A second pair stands a short distance away. Their interaction follows the same pattern, though the details differ. A brief exchange, a pause, a shift of attention. The structure holds across both, repeating without coordination, reinforcing itself through similarity rather than instruction. The street does not separate these moments. It carries them together, allowing them to exist side by side without merging. A woman lowers her voice further as she speaks. The change is slight, almost imperceptible, yet it alters the shape of the words. They no longer travel beyond the immediate space. They remain contained, directed only toward the person standing near her. The man leans in slightly, not to hear more clearly, but to align himself with the lowered tone. The adjustment completes itself without drawing attention. You begin to notice how listening changes. It becomes more focused, more contained, narrowing to the space directly in front of the body. Sounds that fall outside this range fade more quickly, their presence acknowledged but not followed. The ear no longer reaches outward. It holds what is near, allowing the rest to pass without engagement. A brief exchange of objects occurs between the two. A small item passes from one hand to another, its transfer as quiet as the words that accompany it. The object is not examined. It is received, held, then placed out of sight. The action does not extend the conversation. It completes it. The man steps back. The movement is measured, aligned with the rhythm that governs the space. The woman remains where she is, her posture unchanged. The distance between them increases slightly, restoring the margin that was preserved at the beginning. The conversation does not end with a clear signal. It dissolves, returning both to the flow of the street without marking its conclusion. You find that conversations no longer occupy time in the same way. They do not expand to fill it. They pass through it, brief and contained, leaving the larger structure untouched. Another pair forms further along. The pattern repeats. Not identically, but without deviation. Words are exchanged, then withheld. Pauses settle, then release. Attention shifts, then returns. The language holds. And within its narrowing, something begins to take shape, a form of communication that relies as much on absence as on presence, on what is left unsaid as on what is spoken. The conversation continues, even when no words follow. The conversations continue in fragments, never extending far enough to gather weight. They appear briefly along the street, at corners, near doorways, beside windows where reflections soften the outlines of those who stand close enough to speak. Each exchange begins within the same narrow frame, shaped before the first word arrives, held in place by a structure that limits what can pass between one person and another. The voices remain low, not in response to a single cause, but as part of a pattern that has settled into the body. A man pauses beside a doorway, his hand resting against the frame as though the contact provides a boundary for the moment that follows. Another figure approaches, their steps slowing without fully stopping, their posture adjusting just enough to create the space required for an exchange. They do not greet one another. The recognition is immediate, contained within the alignment of their presence rather than expressed through words. A sentence forms. It moves carefully, each word placed with precision, leaving no excess that might extend beyond what is necessary. The response arrives in the same manner, completing the exchange without opening it further. There is no visible effort to continue. The conversation holds for a moment, then settles into silence without interruption. You begin to notice how endings no longer require closure. There is no final word, no gesture that marks the conclusion. The absence of continuation becomes the signal itself, allowing both to step away without acknowledgement. The space between them widens again, restoring the distance that existed before the exchange began. Further along, two figures walk side by side. Their steps align, their movement coordinated without visible effort. A few words pass between them, carried in a tone that remains even, restrained, almost indistinct against the rhythm of their footsteps. The conversation does not alter their pace. It moves alongside it, matching the cadence of their movement rather than shaping it. One of them glances briefly toward the other, then returns their gaze forward. The gesture is small, contained, and does not invite a response. The other continues walking, their posture unchanged, their attention fixed on the path ahead. The exchange concludes without being marked, absorbed into the motion that carries them forward. You begin to sense how language no longer seeks to reveal. It serves to maintain, to confirm what is already understood, to acknowledge without expanding. Words become tools of alignment rather than exploration, shaping the interaction without allowing it to extend beyond its boundaries. A woman stands near a window, speaking to someone just inside. The glass separates them, softening the sound, limiting the reach of their voices. The conversation unfolds in short segments, each part contained within the space directly between them. The woman does not lean closer. The figure inside does not step forward. The distance holds, defining the exchange as much as the words themselves. A pause follows. Neither moves to fill it. The silence does not invite continuation. It completes what has already been said, allowing the conversation to remain within its limits. After a moment, the woman steps back, her attention shifting toward the street. The figure inside withdraws from the window, their presence fading into the interior. The exchange ends without a signal. You begin to understand how silence organizes interaction. It shapes where words can exist, how long they can remain, and when they must stop. The body learns to follow this structure, adjusting its movements to fit within the space that language allows. Speech becomes one element among many, no longer dominant, no longer leading. A group forms briefly at the edge of the street. Three figures stand close enough to speak, their arrangement slightly angled, preserving the distance that defines the interaction. A few words pass between them, each sentence shorter than the last, each response narrowing the exchange further. No one raises their voice. No one steps closer. The conversation contracts, then holds. One of them turns away. The movement is slow, deliberate, contained. The others do not follow. The group dissolves as quietly as it formed, each figure returning to their path without looking back. You notice how conversations no longer create connection in the usual sense. They do not draw people together. They maintain a shared understanding without requiring proximity to deepen. The interaction exists within its own limits, defined by what is permitted to pass between one person and another. A child speaks briefly, their voice slightly louder than the others. An adult responds with a gentle lowering of tone, guiding the volume back into alignment with the surrounding space. The adjustment is immediate, absorbed without resistance. The child's voice softens, the difference disappearing as quickly as it appeared. You begin to see how correction happens within the flow. No instruction is given. No boundary is stated. The structure holds through subtle shifts, through small adjustments that bring each element back into alignment without disrupting the surface. The street continues to carry its steady rhythm. Within it, conversations appear and dissolve, their presence marked not by what is said, but by how little is allowed to remain. The language holds, not as a means of expression, but as a form of containment. And within that containment, the condition deepens, settling into the way people speak, the way they listen, the way they allow silence to complete what words no longer carry. The conversations continue, even when nothing is said. Evenings that do not announce themselves. The evening does not arrive all at once. It settles gradually, carried in the slow dimming of the light as it withdraws from the upper walls and leaves the street in a softer, more diffused tone. The outlines of buildings remain, though their edges lose definition, blending slightly into the air that now holds less brightness. Shadows lengthen without drawing attention, extending across the pavement until they merge with one another, forming a continuous surface that no longer separates one object from the next. The street continues its movement, though at a reduced pace. Footsteps remain steady, but fewer in number, each one passing with greater distance between the next. The spaces that open between people widen, not through intention, but through the natural thinning of presence as the day recedes. Doors open and close with the same controlled motion as before, though the intervals between them grow longer, allowing the quiet to settle more deeply between each sound. A window glows faintly from within. The light does not reach far beyond the glass. It remains contained, illuminating only the immediate space inside, where a figure moves slowly, their outline visible but indistinct. The room beyond appears unchanged, its arrangement holding the same structure seen earlier, though now softened by the reduced light. The figure pauses near the window, then steps away, leaving the glow to stand on its own. You begin to notice how the transition to evening carries no signal. There is no moment that marks its arrival. It unfolds through accumulation, through the gradual reduction of what was present before. The body adjusts without awareness, responding to the change in light, in sound, in the density of movement, without needing to identify it as a shift. A man walks along the edge of the street, his pace unchanged, though the environment around him has altered. The details that once defined the space have softened, their clarity reduced, their presence less distinct. He does not slow. His steps remain aligned with the rhythm that has carried him through the day, his movement continuous, unaffected by the fading light. A door opens briefly, releasing a narrow band of brightness onto the pavement. It stretches outward, then retracts as the door closes again, leaving the street in its previous state. The moment does not linger. It appears, then disappears, absorbed into the sequence without altering it. No one turns toward it. The light exists within its own boundary, contained and temporary. You begin to sense how the evening holds a different kind of stillness. It is not the same as the quiet of the rooms. It exists within the open space, laid over the street without enclosing it. The sounds that remain, footsteps, distant movement, the faint metallic rhythm, carry further now, their presence more pronounced against the reduced activity. Yet they do not dominate. They settle into the same steady pattern, maintaining continuity rather than disrupting it. A figure stands at the corner, their posture unchanged as the light fades around them. They do not move immediately. Their presence appears suspended, held within the narrowing range of visibility that the evening allows. When they do step forward, the motion is slow, measured, aligned with the reduced pace of the street. The transition is complete within the movement itself, requiring no acknowledgement. Windows close one by one. The sound is soft, controlled, each closure marking a small shift within the structure of the buildings. The interiors withdraw further from the exterior, their light contained, their presence reduced to faint glows that do not extend beyond their frames. The street remains, but it holds less of what lies behind it. You begin to notice how boundaries strengthen. The separation between inside and outside becomes more defined, not through barriers, but through the absence of shared light. What occurs within the rooms remains there, no longer visible even in fragments. The street carries only what is present upon it, its surface uninterrupted by the details that once filtered through the windows. A cart remains at the corner, its outline now less distinct. The fabric covering its contents absorbs the fading light, blending into the surrounding shadow. It continues to mark the space, though its presence is quieter, less visible, more integrated into the surface of the street. People move around it as they did before, their paths adjusting without breaking stride. The metallic rhythm persists, though it feels more distant now. Its repetition continues, steady and unchanging, yet its source remains out of view. It no longer draws attention. It exists as part of the evening, integrated into the reduced soundscape without altering its structure. You begin to understand how the day does not end. It transitions. The patterns that defined it do not disappear. They carry forward, adjusting to the change in light, in movement, in presence, without losing their form. The evening does not replace the day. It reshapes it, narrowing its expression while preserving its continuity. A figure passes beneath a dim light fixed to the side of a building. For a moment, their outline becomes clearer, defined by the brief illumination, then fades again as they move beyond it. The light does not follow. It remains where it is, marking a small point within the larger space, unchanged by what passes through it. The street continues. Quieter now, less defined, but unbroken. And within that continuity, the conditions that have settled throughout the day begin to carry into the evening, not as something new, but as an extension of what has already taken hold. The evening deepens without marking its own progression. The remaining light withdraws further, no longer touching the lower walls, leaving only a faint residue along the upper edges where it lingers before fading completely. The street does not darken evenly. It gathers pockets of shadow that expand gradually, joining together until the surface becomes continuous again, though now defined by absence rather than presence. The shapes remain, but their clarity softens, their boundaries less certain, their distinctions quieter. A figure moves along the pavement, their steps slower now, though not deliberately so. The reduction in pace does not signal fatigue. It aligns with the diminished movement around them, the widening spaces between sounds, the extended intervals between passing footsteps. The body adjusts to this change without instruction, settling into a rhythm that no longer follows the pace of the day, but does not resist it either. A window opens slightly, then closes again. The action is brief, contained within a narrow band of light that escapes and retracts before it can spread. The interior remains unseen, its presence suggested only by the glow that briefly touches the street. No voice follows. No movement extends beyond the frame. The separation holds, more firmly now, as the evening draws inward. You begin to notice how attention narrows. It no longer moves across the entire street. It settles within smaller ranges, focusing on what remains visible, what remains audible, what remains close enough to register. The distant fades more quickly. The near becomes more defined, though only within the limits allowed by the diminishing light. A man stands beneath a fixed lamp, its glow steady and contained. The light does not extend far beyond its immediate circle. It defines a small area within which detail returns briefly, the edge of a coat, the outline of a hand, the texture of the pavement. Outside this circle, the street resumes its softened form. The man does not step beyond the light immediately. He remains within it, his presence held in sharper relief before gradually moving back into the dimness. The metallic rhythm continues, now further removed. Its repetition remains unchanged, though the distance between each sound feels wider, as if the evening has stretched the space through which it travels. It no longer blends as easily with other sounds. It stands more distinctly, though still without drawing attention. It persists as a constant, carried forward into the night without variation. A door opens, then closes more quickly than before. The movement is efficient, contained within a shorter span, as though the transition between inside and outside has tightened. The figure who passes through does not linger. Their steps resume immediately, aligning with the quieter pace of the street. The brief interruption resolves without extending beyond the action itself. You begin to sense how the evening holds a different kind of presence. It does not reduce what has already been established. It compresses it. The patterns remain, though expressed within a narrower range. Movements are smaller. Sounds are fewer. The structure holds, but it occupies less space, allowing the quiet to deepen without displacing what exists within it. A pair walks side by side, their steps aligned, their conversation absent. They do not speak. Their presence together does not require it. The distance between them remains consistent, neither closing nor widening. When they reach a corner, they part without hesitation, each continuing along a separate path without turning back. The separation is immediate, contained within the movement itself. Windows remain closed. Their surfaces reflect the dim light, offering no view of what lies within. The interiors have withdrawn fully, their presence no longer shared with the street. The boundary is complete, held not by force, but by the absence of connection between the spaces. You begin to understand how the evening does not introduce new conditions. It reveals what has already settled. The restraint in movement, the containment in sound, the narrowing of interaction, all remain, now more visible in their reduced form. Without the fuller activity of the day, these elements stand more clearly, though still without drawing attention to themselves. A faint movement occurs at the edge of the street, barely visible. A figure crosses from one side to the other, their outline blending with the surrounding shadow. The motion is continuous, uninterrupted, carried through the space without leaving a trace. When they reach the opposite side, they disappear into the dimness, their presence absorbed into the larger continuity. The street continues. Not as it was in the morning. Not as it was in the afternoon. But as a quieter extension of both. The rhythm remains. The structure holds. And within that held structure, the conditions that have taken root throughout the day persist into the evening, no longer separate from the environment that carries them forward. They do not fade. They settle. Nights that settle without witness. The night does not arrive as an absence. It gathers. The remaining light withdraws completely, leaving behind a surface that holds only what can be carried by the faintest sources. A distant lamp, a narrow glow from behind a closed curtain, the soft reflection of something that does not fully reveal itself. The street remains visible, but only in parts, each section emerging briefly before dissolving back into the surrounding dimness. Nothing is fully lost. It is simply no longer held in the same way. The movement that continues does so with less distinction. Footsteps pass without clear direction, their origin and destination contained within the sound itself rather than the space it crosses. A figure moves along the edge of the street, their outline incomplete, appearing and disappearing as they pass through uneven light. The body does not change its pace. It follows the same measured rhythm, carried forward without needing to adjust to what is no longer fully visible. A window holds a steady glow. Behind it, a shadow shifts slowly, its form indistinct, its movement continuous but contained. The interior remains separate, defined by its own light, its own rhythm, its own quiet structure. The street does not reach into it. The separation is complete, not enforced, but maintained through the absence of connection. You begin to notice how the night holds what the day no longer carries. Details recede, leaving only the structure that underlies them. The patterns remain, though stripped of their surface variation. Movement becomes simpler. Sound becomes clearer in its isolation. The body continues, guided not by what it sees, but by what it has already learned to expect. A man stands near the cart at the corner, his presence marked only by the way the dim light gathers briefly against his coat before slipping away. He does not move immediately. The stillness does not isolate him. It places him within the same continuity that has carried the street through the day. When he does step forward, the motion is smooth, unbroken, requiring no adjustment to the darkness that surrounds him. A door opens slowly, releasing a narrow band of light that falls across the pavement. The interior remains unseen beyond that threshold. The light stretches outward, then retracts as the door closes again, leaving the surface unchanged. The figure who passed through is no longer visible. The moment completes itself without extension, absorbed into the night as though it had not occurred. You begin to sense how the night removes the need for visibility. The actions continue without requiring confirmation. The body moves, the door opens, the step is taken, all without the need to be seen fully. The structure holds even when it is no longer observed, sustained by repetition rather than by presence. A faint sound emerges, then fades. It carries no clear source, no defined direction. It exists briefly within the space, then dissolves into the surrounding quiet. The absence that follows does not feel empty. It holds the same continuity, the same steady rhythm, now expressed through the reduction of what is heard. Inside a room, the clock continues its motion. The sound is softer now, absorbed by the walls, its rhythm maintained without drawing attention. A figure sits in the dimness, their posture unchanged, their presence defined more by stillness than by form. The room holds them as it did before, though now the boundaries are less visible, their edges softened by the absence of light. You begin to understand how the night carries the conditions forward. Nothing is introduced. Nothing is removed. The patterns that form throughout the day persist, now expressed through a quieter, more reduced surface. The structure does not depend on light to remain intact. It exists beneath it, continuing even as visibility fades. A figure crosses the street, their movement barely distinguishable from the surrounding shadow. They do not hesitate. The path is known, carried within the body rather than observed in the environment. Each step follows the one before it with the same measured precision, unaffected by what cannot be seen. The crossing completes itself without interruption, the figure dissolving into the opposite side without leaving a trace. The cart remains. Its outline merges with the darkness, its presence defined only by the absence of movement around it. It continues to mark the space, though its form is no longer clear. The street adjusts to it as before, the paths bending slightly, the rhythm continuing without disruption. You notice how the night does not alter the structure. It reveals its persistence. Without the variation of the day, the underlying pattern becomes more apparent, though still unspoken, still unmarked. The repetition, the alignment, the quiet containment, all remain, carried forward into the reduced light without change. The street continues, held within the night, unbroken. And within that continuity, the conditions that have settled throughout the day move forward, no longer visible in detail, but present in the way everything continues without needing to be seen. The night deepens without altering its direction. What remains visible does so in fragments, a narrow band of light along a wall, the faint outline of a doorway, the soft reflection of a window that no longer reveals what lies behind it. The street holds these fragments without connecting them, allowing each to exist briefly before it fades back into the larger, continuous dimness. Nothing draws the eye for long. Attention settles, then releases, moving without urgency across what can still be perceived. A figure moves along the edge of the pavement, their presence defined more by motion than by form. Each step emerges, then dissolves, the body passing through uneven light that reveals only parts of its outline. The pace remains unchanged. There is no hesitation in the movement, no adjustment to the limited visibility. The path is carried internally, followed without the need to confirm what lies ahead. A door opens again, though more quietly now. The sound is reduced, contained within a narrower range, as though the night itself absorbs what would otherwise travel further. A thin line of light appears, then disappears as the door closes. The figure who passed through leaves no visible trace. The action resolves within the moment, leaving the surface unchanged. You begin to notice how the absence of observation alters nothing. The street continues as it did before, its rhythm sustained without needing to be seen. Movements occur, exchanges complete themselves, objects shift position, all within a space that no longer presents them fully. The structure holds beneath the surface, guiding what continues without requiring visibility. Inside, a room holds a dim, steady glow. A figure sits near the table, their outline barely distinguishable from the surrounding shadow. The objects within the room remain where they were placed, the cup, the chair, the surface of the table, their forms softened, their presence quieter. The clock continues its motion, its sound now almost imperceptible, yet unchanged in its rhythm. The figure does not move. The stillness is not imposed. It has settled, aligning with the reduced activity of the night. The body remains within the space without seeking to alter it, without reaching beyond it. The room holds this condition, containing it without defining it. You begin to understand how the night removes the need for interaction. Not by preventing it, but by allowing everything to continue without requiring acknowledgement. A distant sound emerges, not the metallic rhythm now, but something softer, less defined. It travels briefly, then fades, leaving the space as it was. No one responds. The absence of response does not indicate absence of awareness. It reflects a condition in which response is no longer necessary for continuity to hold. A figure pauses at the corner where the cart remains. Their hand rests lightly against its edge, the contact brief, contained within the movement that brought them there. They do not adjust its position. The cart continues to mark the space as it has throughout the day, though now its presence is felt more than seen. The figure moves on, the contact leaving no trace. You notice how interaction has reduced to contact without consequence. A touch that does not alter. A movement that does not extend. An action that completes itself without creating a change that must be followed. The street carries these moments without interruption, absorbing them into the same steady rhythm that persists beneath the surface. A window, unlit, reflects the faint glow of a distant lamp. The reflection holds for a moment, then shifts as something passes beyond it. The interior remains unseen. The boundary is complete, not through closure, but through the absence of shared light. You begin to sense how the night reveals the full extent of what has settled. Without the movement of the day, without the variation of light, the underlying condition remains alone, carried forward without distraction. The patterns no longer compete with activity. They exist in their simplest form, sustained by repetition, by alignment, by the quiet continuity that no longer requires attention. The figure at the edge of the street stops briefly, then continues. The pause does not signal change. It completes a moment. The movement resumes without alteration, the rhythm intact. The street continues. Not observed. Not interrupted. But held. And within that held continuity, the conditions that have shaped the day persist into the night, fully settled, no longer distinct from the space in which they exist. They do not recede. They remain. Mornings that resume without question. The morning returns without announcing itself as new. Light gathers slowly along the upper edges of the buildings, touching the same surfaces it did before, following the same quiet paths as it descends. The street reappears in fragments, a doorway, a window, the outline of the cart at the corner, each element emerging from the dimness without resistance. Nothing feels reintroduced. It feels resumed. The first movement is not distinct. A door opens, then closes, the sound familiar in its restraint. A figure steps out, their posture already aligned with the rhythm that will carry the day forward. There is no adjustment, no visible transition from night to morning. The body continues where it left off, guided by patterns that did not pause when the light receded. You begin to notice how continuity replaces beginning. The day does not start. It continues. Footsteps return to the pavement, spaced at intervals that match the structure already in place. The distance between them remains measured, neither closing nor expanding beyond what has been learned. A man walks past the cart without looking at it, his path bending slightly to accommodate its position, just as it did before. The adjustment is immediate, requiring no awareness to complete. A window opens slightly, then stops. The hand that holds it in place does not lean outward. It remains within the boundary, allowing the light to enter without extending beyond the frame. The view is partial, controlled. The street is visible in segments, enough to confirm that it continues, not enough to invite anything beyond observation. Inside the shop, the woman stands behind the counter. Her hands rest lightly against the surface, her posture unchanged from the day before. The shelves remain arranged as they were, their gaps integrated into the structure, no longer drawing attention. The ledger lies in its place, partially concealed, its presence constant without being emphasized. She does not prepare. She does not begin. She is already within the process. A figure enters. The movement is immediate, aligned with the structure that holds the room. There is no pause at the threshold. The exchange begins without introduction, following the same sequence that has already been established. A small object is placed on the counter. The woman reaches for it. The motion completes itself without variation. You begin to sense how repetition removes the need for awareness. Each action follows the one before it without requiring decision. The sequence carries itself forward, sustained by the alignment of those who move within it. The body does not question. It performs. Outside, the line forms again. It does not need to be constructed. It emerges from the same small pauses, the same measured distances, the same quiet understanding that holds it together. The door at the front opens and closes with the same steady rhythm. The line advances without sound, each step following the one before it, the spacing preserved without effort. A child stands beside an adult, their posture already aligned with the stillness that surrounds them. The difference that once marked their movement has faded. They remain within the same narrow range, their presence contained, their actions shaped by the structure that has settled into place. The adjustment is complete. It no longer requires correction. You begin to notice how the morning carries no hesitation. There is no moment of reconsideration, no pause that invites change. The patterns resume fully formed, their continuity unbroken by the passage of time. What was learned has become what is done. A conversation begins near the corner. The words are brief, contained, shaped by the same narrowing that defined them before. A question, a response, a pause. The exchange completes itself quickly, dissolving into silence without marking its end. The speakers step apart, their paths continuing without deviation. The paper moves again. It passes from one hand to another, its transfer contained within the same precise gestures. It does not pause. It does not draw attention. Its movement resumes as though it had never stopped, integrated into the flow of the street without interruption. You begin to understand how memory settles into the body, not as something recalled, but as something performed. The actions do not require thought. They emerge, carried by repetition, reinforced through continuation. The body knows the spacing, the timing, the sequence. It moves accordingly. The cart remains at the corner, its presence unchanged, its position constant. It continues to mark the space, though no one acknowledges it directly. Movement bends around it, the adjustment immediate, the pattern preserved. The metallic rhythm returns. It enters the morning as it did before, steady, unaltered, integrated into the soundscape without drawing attention. It does not signal anything. It persists. You begin to see how the day no longer introduces itself. It does not ask to be understood. It continues. The street holds. The shop functions. The line advances. The conversations narrow. The paper moves. And within that continuity, the structure that has taken hold remains fully intact, no longer distinct from the actions that sustain it. Nothing has changed. And yet, nothing remains separate from what has settled. The morning settles fully into itself, not by expanding, but by repeating what has already taken form. The light strengthens along the surfaces it knows, tracing the same lines across windows and door frames, resting briefly on the pavement before shifting again. It does not reveal anything new. It confirms what remains. The street becomes clearer, but not different, its details returning only to the extent that they have always been present. Movement increases, though not in variation. More footsteps enter the rhythm, yet each follows the same measured spacing, the same quiet alignment that has already been established. The flow thickens slightly, but it does not change direction. It continues along the same paths, bending around the same fixed points, adjusting without interruption. The presence of more bodies does not alter the structure. It reinforces it. A man pauses briefly near the shop window, his reflection merging with the arrangement behind the glass. He does not linger. The act of looking completes itself quickly, his gaze moving across the surface without settling on any one point. The objects within remain as they were, their positions unchanged, their meaning absorbed into the system that defines them. He steps away without hesitation, his movement returning to the street without leaving a trace. Inside, the woman moves between the shelves with the same quiet precision. Her hands adjust the placement of items that do not require rearrangement, aligning them within a structure that depends on exactness rather than necessity. The gaps remain, though they no longer draw the eye. They exist as part of the pattern, integrated into the arrangement without disruption. The ledger rests where it was placed, its presence constant, its use continuous. A figure enters and places a paper on the counter. The motion follows the established sequence, requiring no variation. The woman takes it, aligns it, processes it without visible examination. The paper passes through her hands as others have before, its role defined by the system rather than by its content. It is folded again, placed beneath the counter, joining those that have already been absorbed into the hidden accumulation. You begin to notice how accumulation no longer builds toward anything. It gathers. It holds. It remains within the structure without altering its surface. Outside, the line continues to form and dissolve in quiet succession. Each person enters it without instruction, aligns within it without adjustment, leaves it without acknowledgement. The door at the front opens and closes with the same steady rhythm, releasing one, receiving another. The sequence holds, its repetition smoothing the passage of time until the movement feels continuous rather than segmented. A woman near the middle of the line adjusts her position slightly, then stills. The motion is brief, absorbed immediately into the pattern. No one responds. No one needs to. The alignment restores itself without visible effort, the structure maintaining its form through the quiet cooperation of those within it. You begin to sense how the body no longer distinguishes between action and routine. Each movement is carried forward without interruption, its purpose contained within the act itself. There is no pause to consider, no space for deviation. The sequence defines the behavior, and the behavior sustains the sequence. A conversation begins, then narrows. The words remain close, their tone even, their duration brief. The exchange completes itself without expansion, dissolving into silence that does not feel incomplete. The speakers step apart, their paths continuing without overlap, the interaction absorbed into the larger flow. The metallic rhythm persists. It remains steady, unaltered, its repetition forming a constant layer beneath the sounds of the street. It does not signal. It does not change. It exists, carried forward into each moment without interruption. You begin to understand how awareness recedes. The actions continue, but the attention that once accompanied them fades. The body performs without observation, moving through the sequence without needing to register each step. The structure holds, sustained by repetition rather than by conscious engagement. A child walks beside an adult, their steps aligned, their movement contained within the same narrow range. There is no adjustment needed. The alignment has already taken place. The difference that once required correction has been absorbed, integrated into the pattern that now governs all movement. The cart remains at the corner. Its presence unchanged, its position constant. The paths that move around it do so without variation, the adjustment immediate, the pattern preserved. It continues to mark the space without drawing attention, its role defined by its permanence. You notice how nothing resists. Nothing interrupts. Nothing deviates. The morning continues, not as a series of moments, but as a single, extended condition that holds everything within it. The street carries the movement. The shop processes the exchange. The line advances. The conversations narrow. The paper moves. And within all of it, the structure that has taken hold persists without question, no longer separate from the lives that move within it. It does not need to be reinforced. It sustains itself. Thoughts that settle without being spoken. The thoughts do not arrive as interruption. They form within the continuation of movement, emerging quietly as the body carries out what it already knows. A man walks along the street, his steps aligned with the rhythm that has guided him through the morning, his posture unchanged, his gaze directed forward without searching. The environment does not shift. The pattern holds. And within that steadiness, something begins to gather beneath the surface, not separate from the action, but contained within it. He passes the same window, the same doorway, the same cart at the corner. Each element appears as it did before, its presence familiar, integrated into the path without requiring attention. The body moves around them without adjustment, the sequence completing itself without variation. The repetition does not draw focus. It allows it to recede, creating space for something else to emerge, something that does not interrupt the movement, but accompanies it. You begin to notice how awareness turns inward without withdrawing from the world. The street remains visible. The sounds continue. The actions unfold. And yet, the attention that once followed these elements now rests elsewhere, held within a quieter layer that does not present itself directly. The body continues to perform, while the mind settles into a different kind of observation. A woman stands at the counter inside the shop, her hands moving through the same sequence of actions, aligning, receiving, placing. The objects pass through her hands as they have before, their movement precise, contained. The ledger opens and closes. The paper is folded, stored, removed from view. Nothing changes. And within that continuity, her gaze lingers for a fraction longer on the surface of the counter before moving on, the pause so brief it does not alter the flow. The thought does not form as a question. It does not seek an answer. It exists as a recognition that does not extend into language. You begin to understand how thinking adjusts to the structure that surrounds it. It no longer moves outward, exploring, expanding, seeking connection. It narrows, aligning itself with the limits that define the environment. The mind follows the same patterns as the body, repeating, containing, allowing certain directions to close while others remain. A man stands in the line, his position held within the same measured spacing. He does not shift. He does not look around. The door opens, the line advances, and he steps forward with the same controlled motion as before. The sequence continues, uninterrupted. And within it, his gaze lowers slightly, not in response to anything external, but as part of the inward turn that has begun to take hold. The thought does not remain. It passes. Not dismissed, not resolved, simply carried through the moment without extending beyond it. You begin to notice how ideas no longer accumulate. They do not build upon one another. They do not lead toward conclusion. They appear, settle briefly, then dissolve, leaving the surface unchanged. A conversation forms near the corner, the words contained, The exchange brief. One of the speakers pauses, their sentence ending slightly earlier than expected. The silence that follows does not invite continuation. It completes the thought without needing to extend it. The other nods once, the gesture sufficient to carry the exchange to its end. They step apart, their paths continuing without deviation. The thought remains unspoken, not withheld, not suppressed. It simply does not move beyond the boundary that has formed around it. You begin to sense how the internal world reshapes itself. Not through decision, but through repetition. The patterns that govern the external actions begin to mirror themselves within the mind, creating a structure that limits what can be held, what can be explored, what can remain. A woman walks along the street, the paper in her sleeve moving with her steps. She does not touch it. She does not confirm its presence. The act of carrying has already been completed. And within that completion, her attention shifts briefly, not toward the object, but toward the absence of needing to think about it. The moment passes, absorbed into the rhythm of her movement. The thought does not return. It does not need to. You begin to understand how the mind adapts by reducing itself. Not in capacity, but in reach. It remains active, aware, engaged, yet within a narrower field, one that aligns with the structure that has taken hold around it. A man pauses near the cart, his hand resting briefly against its edge. The contact is the same as before, the motion unchanged. And yet, the awareness that accompanies it is different, quieter, less defined, less inclined to follow the gesture into something more. He moves on, the moment complete, the thought already dissolved. The street continues. The shop functions. The line advances. The conversations narrow. The paper moves. And within all of it, the thoughts that once might have expanded now settle into the same pattern, appearing and dissolving without leaving a trace. They do not build. They do not question. They remain, contained within the structure that no longer requires them to do more. The thoughts continue to move beneath the surface, but they no longer gather into something that asks to be held. They pass through the mind as the body continues its quiet sequence, appearing within the rhythm rather than interrupting it. A man stands at the edge of the street, his posture aligned with the space around him, his gaze fixed forward without seeking detail. The environment remains unchanged. The movement continues. And within that continuity, the awareness that once followed each element begins to loosen its grip. He notices the cart, not as an object to consider, but as part of the path that adjusts around it. The recognition occurs without extension. It does not lead to memory, to association, to reflection. It completes itself within the moment, then recedes, leaving the movement uninterrupted. You begin to see how the mind releases what it does not need to carry. Not through effort, but through absence of continuation. A woman in the shop pauses briefly as she folds a paper. Her hands hold the motion at its midpoint, the edges aligned but not yet pressed together. The pause is slight, contained within the gesture, and within it something lingers, not fully formed, not fully articulated. Then the fold completes, the paper is placed beneath the counter, and the moment resolves without extending beyond the action. The thought does not remain. It does not return. It has already settled into the structure that does not allow it to grow. You begin to notice how questions no longer reach their full shape. They begin, then narrow, then dissolve before they can open outward. The mind adjusts to this, not by resisting, but by aligning itself with the limits that have formed. The direction of thought shortens. The distance it travels reduces. The movement remains, but its range contracts. A man in the line shifts his weight slightly, then stills. The motion completes itself without drawing attention. His gaze lowers, not in response to anything visible, but as part of the inward alignment that now accompanies his presence. The door opens. The line advances. He steps forward. The sequence continues. The thought does not interrupt the movement. It moves within it. You begin to understand how internal resistance changes form. It no longer appears as tension, as conflict, as something that presses against the structure. It softens, diffuses, settling into smaller fragments that do not gather into opposition. The absence of expression does not indicate absence of awareness. It reflects a shift in how awareness is held. A conversation forms briefly near the corner. A sentence begins, then shortens, its ending arriving earlier than expected. The speaker does not continue. The listener nods once. The exchange completes itself within that boundary, leaving no space for extension. The words do not carry beyond what is necessary. The silence that follows is not empty. It is sufficient. The thought remains within that silence. Not unspoken, but unextended. You begin to see how justification begins to take shape, though not yet in words. It exists as a quiet alignment between what is done and what is held internally. The actions continue without deviation. The mind follows, adjusting itself to remain consistent with the pattern. The need to question does not disappear. It changes form, becoming less defined, less insistent, less likely to emerge fully. A woman walks along the street, her pace steady, her posture unchanged. She passes the same window, the same doorway, the same sequence of objects that define the path. Each recognition occurs without accumulation. The environment does not prompt reflection. It confirms continuation. The body moves. The mind aligns. You begin to notice how continuity replaces deliberation. The decisions that once might have required attention now complete themselves without it. The sequence defines the outcome. The mind follows, allowing the action to resolve without needing to intervene. A faint sound emerges, then fades. It does not draw focus. It does not invite inquiry. It passes through the awareness without altering it, absorbed into the same steady rhythm that holds everything in place. The thought does not follow. It remains within its boundary. Contained. A man pauses at the doorway of the shop, his hand resting briefly on the frame. The contact is the same as before, the motion unchanged. And within it, there is no extension, no reflection, no movement beyond the gesture itself. He steps inside. The sequence resumes. You begin to understand how the internal world reshapes itself fully. Not through removal, but through limitation. The mind continues to function, to observe, to register, yet within a structure that narrows its reach, that contains its movement, that prevents it from extending beyond what the environment allows. The street continues. The shop functions. The line advances. The conversations narrow. The paper moves. And within all of it, the thoughts that once might have expanded now settle completely into the pattern, no longer separate from the actions that carry them forward. They do not resist. They do not accumulate. They align. And in that alignment, the final layer of adjustment begins to take hold, not as a moment, not as a decision, but as a condition that no longer requires awareness to continue. Justifications that do not announce themselves. The justification does not begin as a statement. It forms quietly, not in language, but in the alignment between what is done and what is allowed to remain. A man stands at the edge of the street, his posture steady, his gaze directed forward without searching. The movement around him continues, footsteps passing, doors opening and closing, the faint rhythm of distant sound, all held within the same structure that has carried the day forward. Nothing calls for decision. Nothing interrupts. And within that continuity, something settles. Not as a thought that rises and speaks, but as an absence of friction. He steps forward, adjusting his path slightly to move around the cart at the corner. The motion completes itself without hesitation, his body following the same curve it has followed before. The adjustment requires no attention. It occurs within the sequence, not outside it. When he continues, there is no sense that anything has been chosen. The movement simply aligns. You begin to notice how ease replaces tension. Not because the conditions have changed, but because the resistance that once accompanied them has softened, dispersed into smaller fragments that no longer gather into something that must be addressed. A woman stands behind the counter in the shop, her hands moving through the same quiet process, receiving, aligning, placing. A paper rests before her. She does not unfold it fully. She does not examine it beyond what is required. Her fingers press it into its final shape, then move it beneath the counter, where it joins the others that have already passed through the same sequence. The action completes itself without pause. There is no question. Not because the question has been answered, but because it does not reach the surface. You begin to understand how justification exists without articulation. It does not need to explain. It sustains. A man stands in the line, his position held within the same measured spacing. The door opens. The line advances. He steps forward. The sequence repeats. His body follows it without deviation, without interruption, without delay. The movement does not require thought. It carries him. The idea that might have interrupted, that might have asked whether to remain, whether to step out, whether to change, does not form fully. It narrows. It dissolves. The step completes. You begin to see how alignment becomes self-reinforcing. Each action confirms the next. Each continuation reduces the space in which something different might occur. A conversation forms near the corner. A sentence begins, then shifts, its shape adjusting before it is fully spoken. The words that follow are simpler, more contained, their meaning reduced to what is necessary to maintain the exchange. The speaker does not correct themselves. The listener does not question the change. The conversation completes within its new boundary. The original thought does not return. It has already been replaced by what fits. You begin to notice how substitution takes the place of confrontation. What does not align is not expressed. What remains is what continues. A woman walks along the street, her step steady, her posture unchanged. The paper rests within her sleeve, its presence unacknowledged. She does not touch it. She does not confirm it. The act of carrying has become part of the sequence, no longer requiring attention. The moment in which it might have been considered has passed without forming. You begin to understand how actions become sufficient. They do not need to be examined. They do not need to be justified outwardly. They align with what is already in motion, and that alignment sustains them. A man pauses briefly near the doorway of the shop, his hand resting against the frame. The gesture is familiar, repeated, contained. He does not linger. The pause completes itself without extending into something more. He steps inside. The sequence resumes. The thought that might have accompanied the pause does not appear. Not because it has been removed, but because it no longer rises. You begin to sense how the internal and external begin to match. The structure outside, the repetition, the containment, the alignment, finds its reflection within the mind. The boundaries that shape action begin to shape thought. The distance thought can travel narrows to match the distance action allows. A faint sound passes through the street, then fades. It does not draw attention. It does not interrupt. It confirms the continuity that holds everything in place. The justification does not need to speak. It is present in the absence of interruption, in the ease of continuation, in the quiet completion of each action as it follows the last. The street continues. The shop functions. The line advances. The conversations narrow. The paper moves. And within all of it, the alignment deepens, settling into a condition that no longer requires explanation to persist. The justification continues without forming into words. It settles into the space between actions, carried forward by the same steady rhythm that guides the body through the day. A man walks along the street, his path unchanged, his pace aligned with the movement around him. The environment holds, the shop, the line, the cart at the corner, each element in place, each interaction contained. Nothing calls for interruption. Nothing invites reconsideration. And within that continuity, the absence of resistance remains. You begin to notice how consistency becomes its own explanation. The repetition of actions, the alignment of movement, the quiet completion of each sequence, all of it reinforces what continues without requiring it to be examined. The body follows the pattern. The mind aligns with it. The need to question does not disappear. It settles into a form that no longer rises. A woman stands at the counter, her hands moving through the same process. A paper arrives. She receives it, aligns it, places it beneath the counter. The motion completes itself with the same precision as before. There is no pause, no variation. The action sustains itself through repetition, requiring nothing beyond its continuation. The thought that might have asked why does not appear, not because it has been answered, but because it has already been absorbed. You begin to understand how explanation shifts from language to structure. What is done repeatedly no longer needs to be explained. It becomes the explanation. A man in the line steps forward as the door opens. The movement is immediate, contained within the sequence. He does not hesitate. He does not look away. The step completes itself within the rhythm that has already been established. The idea of stepping out of line does not form. It does not reach the point where it could interrupt the action. The continuation holds. You begin to see how alternatives recede, not through refusal, but through absence. What is not practiced does not remain accessible in the same way. A conversation begins, then adjusts. A sentence shifts mid-formation, its meaning narrowing before it is fully expressed. The speaker continues without pause, the altered version replacing what might have been said. The listener accepts it without reaction. The exchange completes within its contained form. The original version does not return. It has already been replaced by what aligns. You begin to notice how alignment removes the need for correction. When the structure holds, deviation does not emerge clearly enough to require response. A woman walks along the street, her movement steady. She passes the same objects, the same spaces, the same sequence of interactions that define the day. Each recognition occurs without extension. The environment does not invite reflection. It confirms continuity. The body moves. The mind follows. The paper in her sleeve remains untouched. Its presence does not require acknowledgement. The act of carrying continues without attention. You begin to understand how responsibility changes form. It does not disappear. It becomes diffused, spread across the sequence, held within the structure rather than within the individual moment. A man pauses briefly near the cart, his hand resting against its edge. The gesture is unchanged. The contact is the same. The moment completes itself without extending into thought. He moves on, the action absorbed into the rhythm that carries everything forward. The pause does not create space. It confirms the pattern. You begin to sense how the internal world stabilizes within these limits. The fluctuations that once might have emerged, doubt, hesitation, reconsideration, soften into a steadiness that mirrors the environment. The mind does not stop. It aligns. A faint sound passes through the street, then fades. No one turns. No one follows. The absence of response holds. The continuity remains. The justification does not speak. It does not need to. It is present in the way each action completes itself without interruption. In the way each sequence continues without deviation. In the way the structure sustains itself through those who move within it. The street continues. The shop functions. The line advances. The conversations narrow. The paper moves. And within all of it, the alignment settles fully, no longer separate from the actions that carry it forward. It does not require agreement. It does not require belief. It requires only continuation. And that continuation holds. The weight that no longer registers. The weight does not arrive. It is already there. It rests within the structure of the day, carried through the same movements that have repeated without interruption. The street holds it without showing it. The shop contains it without marking it. The line advances beneath it, the conversations narrow around it, the paper moves through it. Nothing changes in form. And yet, something has settled into everything that remains. A man walks along the pavement, his step steady, his posture unchanged. He passes the same doorway, the same window, the same cart at the corner. Each element appears as it has before, integrated into the path without requiring attention. The body adjusts without awareness, the movement completing itself within the established sequence. There is no hesitation, no pause, no visible sign that anything has become heavier. You begin to notice how absence conceals accumulation. Nothing has been added. Nothing has been removed. And yet, the repetition has layered itself, each cycle resting upon the last, forming a density that does not appear in any single moment. A woman stands behind the counter, her hands moving through the same quiet process. A paper arrives. She receives it, aligns it, places it beneath the counter. The motion completes itself with the same precision as before. The stack beneath the surface grows, though it is never seen. The accumulation does not alter the movement. It remains hidden, contained within the structure that continues to hold. She does not pause. She does not look. The weight does not register. You begin to understand how continuation masks its own effect. What repeats without interruption does not announce what it becomes. A man stands in the line, his position held within the same measured spacing. The door opens. The line advances. He steps forward. The sequence continues. The body follows. The mind aligns. There is no moment in which the accumulation becomes visible, no point at which the repetition reveals what it has formed. The step completes. The next follows. The pattern holds. You begin to see how the absence of interruption prevents recognition. Without a break, there is no contrast. Without contrast, there is no measure. A conversation forms near the corner, its words contained, its structure unchanged. A sentence begins, then ends. A pause follows. The exchange completes. The speakers separate. Nothing remains that would indicate what has passed between them. The interaction dissolves into the street, absorbed into the continuity that carries everything forward. The weight does not appear within it. It passes through, unmarked. You begin to notice how the internal world carries what the external does not show. A thought forms, then narrows, then dissolves. A moment of awareness rises, then settles before it can extend. The mind registers something, though it does not hold it long enough to define it. The recognition does not complete itself. It remains partial. A woman walks along the street, her pace steady, her posture unchanged. The paper in her sleeve rests where it has been placed. She does not touch it. She does not confirm it. The act of carrying continues without attention. The movement holds. The sequence sustains itself. The weight travels with her, not as something felt, but as something that does not leave. You begin to understand how persistence replaces perception. What remains constant becomes indistinguishable from what simply is. A man pauses briefly near the cart, his hand resting against its edge. The gesture is the same. The contact is unchanged. The moment completes itself within the movement. He continues on. Nothing marks the pause as different from those that came before it. And yet, something remains. Not in the gesture, but in the accumulation of gestures that have never been interrupted. You begin to sense how the weight exists without location. It is not in the object. Not in the action. Not in the moment. It is in the continuation of all of them. A faint sound passes through the street, then fades. No one turns. No one follows. The absence of response holds. The structure continues. The weight does not register. It does not need to. The street carries it. The shop contains it. The line advances within it. The conversations narrow around it. The paper moves through it. And within all of it, the accumulation settles fully into place, no longer separate from the pattern that sustains it. It does not appear. It remains. The weight remains without declaring itself. It does not press outward. It does not interrupt the rhythm that carries the day forward. It settles within it, held by the same patterns that have repeated without variation. The street continues, the shop functions, the line advances, the conversations narrow, the paper moves, each element sustained by the continuity that no longer requires attention. A man walks past the window again, his reflection merging briefly with the arrangement behind the glass. He does not slow. The act of looking completes itself within a single motion, his gaze passing over the surface without lingering. The objects within remain aligned, their placement unchanged, their gaps integrated into the structure. Nothing draws focus. Nothing asks to be held. The movement continues. You begin to notice how familiarity conceals change. What repeats becomes stable. What remains stable no longer invites examination. The difference between what was and what is no longer forms clearly enough to be recognized. Inside the shop, the woman's hands move through the same sequence. A paper arrives. She receives it, aligns it, places it beneath the counter. The stack grows, though it is never seen. The accumulation continues without altering the visible surface. The action completes itself without pause, without hesitation, without deviation. She does not measure. She does not count. The weight does not gather in a way that can be observed. You begin to understand how concealment does not require intention. It emerges from repetition, from continuity, from the absence of interruption that would allow something to stand apart. A man stands in the line, his posture unchanged. The door opens. The line advances. He steps forward. The sequence repeats. The spacing holds. The movement continues. There is no moment in which the repetition reveals what it carries. Each step remains identical to the last, each action completing itself without extension. The accumulation remains beneath it, unseen, unmarked. You begin to see how the body adapts by carrying without registering. It moves. It aligns. It continues. The weight does not alter the motion. It becomes part of it. A conversation forms near the corner. The words are brief, contained, shaped by the same narrowing that has defined them throughout. A sentence begins, then ends. A pause follows. The exchange dissolves. The speakers separate. Nothing remains to indicate what has passed between them. The weight does not appear in the words. It passes through them. You begin to notice how expression no longer holds what is carried. It reflects only what is allowed to remain. A woman walks along the street, her pace steady, her posture unchanged. The paper in her sleeve remains where it was placed. She does not touch it. She does not confirm it. The act of carrying continues without attention. The movement holds. The sequence sustains itself. The weight travels with her, not as a burden, but as a condition. You begin to understand how the distinction between carrying and being carried begins to dissolve. The body moves through the structure. The structure moves through the body. The separation fades. A man pauses briefly near the cart, his hand resting against its edge. The gesture is unchanged. The contact remains the same. The moment completes itself without extension. He continues on. The pause leaves no trace, absorbed into the rhythm that carries everything forward. And yet, the accumulation remains. Not within the gesture, but within the continuity that allows it to repeat without interruption. You begin to sense how the weight stabilizes. It no longer grows in a way that can be felt. It settles into what is already in place, becomes indistinguishable from it. A faint sound passes through the street, then fades. No one turns. No one follows. The absence of response holds. The structure continues. The weight does not register. It does not need to. It is no longer separate from the pattern that sustains it. The street carries it. The shop contains it. The line advances within it. The conversations narrow around it. The paper moves through it. And within all of it, the accumulation remains fully integrated, no longer distinct from the actions that continue to sustain it. It does not reveal itself. It persists. The shape of a day that no longer changes. The day no longer shifts in ways that can be distinguished. It holds. Light arrives, moves, fades, and returns again, tracing the same surfaces, following the same paths, touching the same edges before withdrawing. The street receives it without alteration. The buildings reflect it without variation. The objects within it remain where they have been placed, their positions stable, their presence integrated into the structure that carries everything forward. A man walks along the pavement, his steps aligned with the rhythm that has already been established. He does not adjust his pace. He does not alter his path. The movement completes itself as it has before, the sequence repeating without interruption. The doorway passes. The window follows. The cart at the corner remains. Each element appears in the same order, the same spacing, the same quiet continuity. You begin to notice how repetition becomes indistinguishable from permanence. What continues without variation no longer feels as though it is repeating. It feels as though it has always been. Inside the shop, the woman stands behind the counter, her hands moving through the same precise sequence. A paper arrives. She receives it, aligns it, places it beneath the counter. The ledger opens and closes. The shelves hold their arrangement. The gaps remain. The objects shift slightly, then settle again. Nothing changes in a way that would require attention. The process does not begin. It does not end. It continues. You begin to understand how time loses its edges. Without variation, there is no point at which one moment separates clearly from the next. The sequence extends, unbroken, forming a surface that does not divide into distinct parts. The day becomes a single, continuous condition, carried forward without interruption. A man stands in the line, his position held within the same measured spacing. The door opens. The line advances. He steps forward. The sequence repeats. The movement does not require awareness. It completes itself within the structure that defines it. The body follows. The mind aligns. The step is not new. It is the same step. Repeated. You begin to see how expectation disappears. There is no anticipation of change. No sense that something different might occur. The continuation itself becomes sufficient. A conversation forms near the corner, its words contained within the same narrow frame. A sentence begins, then ends. A pause follows. The exchange dissolves. The speakers separate. The interaction leaves no trace, absorbed into the flow that carries everything forward. The words do not extend. They do not accumulate. They remain within the limits that define them. You begin to notice how language stabilizes. It no longer shifts. It no longer expands. It reflects the structure that surrounds it, holding only what is necessary to sustain the interaction. A woman walks along the street, her movement steady, her posture unchanged. The paper in her sleeve rests where it has been placed. She does not touch it. She does not confirm it. The act of carrying continues without attention. The movement holds. The sequence sustains itself. The path does not vary. It follows what has already been established. You begin to understand how variation becomes unnecessary. What repeats without interruption no longer invites difference. It holds. A man pauses briefly near the cart, his hand resting against its edge. The gesture is unchanged. The contact remains the same. The moment completes itself within the movement. He continues on. The pause leaves no trace, absorbed into the rhythm that carries everything forward. The repetition holds. Without alteration. Without interruption. You begin to sense how the structure stabilizes fully. It no longer adjusts. It no longer shifts. It remains. The street carries the movement. The shop processes the exchange. The line advances. The conversations narrow. The paper moves. And within all of it, the day takes on a shape that does not change, no longer defined by progression, but by continuation. It does not move forward. It holds in place. And within that held condition, the final layer of adjustment settles, not as a moment, not as a realization, but as a state that no longer requires recognition to persist. The day continues without marking its passage. The light shifts across the same surfaces, though the movement no longer separates one moment from the next. It glides along the walls, rests on the pavement, withdraws, and returns again, yet none of these changes create distinction. The sequence holds as a whole, uninterrupted, each part blending into the next without forming an edge that can be recognized. A man moves along the street, his step steady, his posture unchanged. He passes the same window, the same doorway, the same cart at the corner. Each element appears in the same position, the same alignment, the same quiet continuity. The body does not register repetition as repetition. It moves within it, guided by what has already been established. The motion completes itself, without variation. You begin to notice how difference no longer emerges, not because it has been removed, but because it no longer stands apart from what continues. Inside the shop, the woman's hands move through the same process. A paper arrives. She receives it, aligns it, places it beneath the counter. The ledger opens and closes. The shelves remain as they are. The gaps persist, though they no longer draw attention. The process does not change. It sustains itself through repetition, each action reinforcing the next. The accumulation remains beneath it, unseen, unmarked. You begin to understand how continuity absorbs its own history. What has occurred does not stand behind the present. It is contained within it. A man stands in the line, his position held within the same measured spacing. The door opens. The line advances. He steps forward. The sequence repeats. The movement does not require attention. It completes itself within the structure that defines it. The body follows. The mind aligns. The step does not differ from the one before it, or the one that will follow. You begin to see how time ceases to accumulate in a way that can be felt. It does not gather into memory. It does not form a progression. It remains as a continuous surface, held within the repetition that defines it. A conversation forms near the corner, its words contained, its structure unchanged. A sentence begins, then ends. A pause follows. The exchange dissolves. The speakers separate. Nothing remains to indicate what has passed between them. The interaction does not extend beyond itself. It completes, then disappears. You begin to notice how presence no longer leaves a trace. Each action resolves within its own boundary. Nothing carries forward in a way that alters what comes next. A woman walks along the street, her movement steady, her posture unchanged. The paper in her sleeve remains where it has been placed. She does not touch it. She does not confirm it. The act of carrying continues without attention. The movement holds. The sequence sustains itself. The path remains fixed. Not by force, but by repetition. You begin to understand how the possibility of change recedes. Not through decision, but through absence. What is not practiced does not remain accessible. A man pauses briefly near the cart, his hand resting against its edge. The gesture is unchanged. The contact remains the same. The moment completes itself within the movement. He continues on. The pause leaves no trace, absorbed into the rhythm that carries everything forward. The repetition holds. Fully. Without interruption. You begin to sense how the structure has settled into its final form. Not rigid, not imposed, but sustained. The street carries the movement. The shop processes the exchange. The line advances. The conversations narrow. The paper moves. And within all of it, the day no longer changes. It does not progress. It does not shift. It remains, held within the pattern that now defines it completely. Nothing needs to be reinforced. Nothing needs to be questioned. Nothing needs to be altered. The structure continues. And within that continuation, everything that exists within it does the same. What remains when nothing breaks? The street remains, not as it was before, and not as something that can be separated from what has settled into it, but as a surface that has carried everything forward without interruption. The buildings still hold their shape. The windows still open and close. The cart still marks the corner. The same paths remain visible, traced again and again until they no longer appear as paths at all. Light moves across the walls as it always has. It touches the same edges, rests in the same places, withdraws, and returns. The pattern continues, unchanged in form, though no longer distinct in its movement. It does not reveal anything new. It does not restore what was once visible. It confirms only that the structure holds. A man walks along the pavement, his step steady, his posture unchanged. He passes the same doorway, the same window, the same fixed points that define the space. The movement completes itself without variation, without hesitation, without interruption. The body carries forward what it has learned, not as memory, but as continuation. You begin to notice how nothing signals an ending. There is no moment that marks a shift. No break that separates what has been from what remains. The continuity holds, extending beyond the point where change might have been expected. Inside the shop, the counter remains in place. The shelves hold their arrangement. The gaps persist. The ledger rests where it has always been. Papers remain beneath the surface, accumulated without being seen. The process continues, though it no longer appears as a process. It exists as a condition that does not require recognition. A figure enters. A paper is placed. A hand receives it. The motion completes. Nothing marks it as final. You begin to understand how continuation does not require purpose. It sustains itself. A line forms outside. It assembles quietly, without instruction, without variation. The door opens. One enters. The line advances. The sequence repeats. The spacing holds. The movement continues. No one looks for an end. No one expects one. You begin to see how expectation has receded completely. Not replaced. Not resolved. Simply no longer present. A conversation forms near the corner, its words contained within the same narrow frame. A sentence begins, then ends. A pause follows. The exchange dissolves. The speakers separate. The interaction leaves no trace, absorbed into the surface that carries everything forward. The words do not remain. They do not need to. A woman walks along the street, her movement steady, her posture unchanged. The paper in her sleeve remains where it has been placed. She does not touch it. She does not confirm it. The act of carrying continues without attention. The movement holds. The sequence sustains itself. You begin to notice how what remains is not what happened. It is what continued. A man pauses near the cart, his hand resting briefly against its edge. The gesture is unchanged. The contact remains the same. The moment completes itself within the movement. He continues on. The pause leaves no trace. Nothing accumulates at the surface. Nothing resolves. You begin to understand how absence of rupture defines what follows. There was no break. No moment that forced recognition. No event that required the pattern to stop and reveal itself. The structure held. And because it held, everything within it continued. The street carries the movement. The shop processes the exchange. The line advances. The conversations narrow. The paper moves. And within all of it, what remains is not a memory that stands apart, but a condition that has settled so completely it no longer appears as something that began. It simply is. The day continues beyond what can be marked as its end. Light returns again, touching the same surfaces, following the same paths, resting where it has always rested. The street receives it without distinction, the buildings reflect it without variation, the objects remain where they have been placed. Nothing signals renewal. Nothing suggests departure from what has already taken hold. A figure moves along the pavement, their step steady, their posture unchanged. They pass the same doorway, the same window, the same cart at the corner. Each element appears as it has before, integrated into the movement without requiring attention. The body follows the path, not as something chosen, but as something that continues. You begin to notice how what endures does not present itself as endurance. It does not call attention to its persistence. It remains within the repetition that sustains it. Inside the shop, the counter holds. The shelves remain aligned. The gaps persist. The ledger rests where it has always been. The papers beneath the surface continue to gather without being seen. The process moves forward, not as a sequence that leads somewhere, but as a condition that sustains itself through continuation. A paper arrives. It is received. It is aligned. It is placed. Nothing marks the action as different from those that came before it. You begin to understand how the accumulation does not resolve. It remains contained, carried forward without interruption. Outside, the line forms again. It assembles quietly, the same measured spacing, the same controlled movement. The door opens. One enters. The line advances. The sequence repeats. The structure holds without variation, without deviation, without interruption. No one questions. No one stops. The pattern continues. You begin to see how the absence of disruption allows everything to persist. Without a break, nothing separates itself from what continues. Without separation, nothing demands to be seen. A conversation forms near the corner, its words contained within the same narrow frame. A sentence begins, then ends. A pause follows. The exchange dissolves. The speakers separate. The interaction leaves no trace, absorbed into the surface that carries everything forward. The words do not remain. They do not accumulate. They pass. A woman walks along the street, her movement steady, her posture unchanged. The paper in her sleeve remains where it has been placed. She does not touch it. She does not confirm it. The act of carrying continues without attention. The movement holds. The sequence sustains itself. The path remains. The rhythm holds. You begin to understand how what continues becomes indistinguishable from what is. There is no point at which one can say it has begun. No point at which it can be said to end. A man pauses briefly near the cart, his hand resting against its edge. The gesture is unchanged. The contact remains the same. The moment completes itself within the movement. He continues on. The pause leaves no trace. Nothing accumulates at the surface. Nothing resolves beneath it. You begin to sense how the condition persists beyond recognition. It does not require awareness. It does not require reinforcement. It remains because it continues. The street carries the movement. The shop processes the exchange. The line advances. The conversations narrow. The paper moves. And within all of it, what remains is not an event, not a decision, not a moment that can be named. It is the continuation of everything that was allowed to remain uninterrupted. A pattern that held. A structure that sustained. A quiet alignment that never needed to announce itself to endure. You remain with it for a moment longer. Not to understand, but to notice how little separates what was from what is, and how easily the distance between them can disappear when nothing breaks. The light shifts. The street holds. And the past continues, not behind, but within. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.